Imagine standing at Giza in the dark. Not the tourist Giza of the daytime, the coaches and the ticket booths and the camel handlers and the vendors and the specific noise of a major archaeological site being visited by thousands of people. The Giza of 3 in the morning, when the last of the tourists have gone and the site is quiet and the desert air has cooled from the day's heat to something closer to the temperature of deep stone. The pyramids are behind you, to the southwest. You know they are there without looking. Their bulk changes the quality of the dark in that direction, absorbs the starlight differently. The Great Pyramid of Khufu is the tallest artificial structure on Earth. It held that title for more than 3,000 years, until the Lincoln Cathedral spire surpassed it in 1311 CE. And even in darkness it is present as a mass, as a weight, as a specific quality of absence in the sky. But you are not looking at the pyramids. You are looking east, into a hollow in the plateau, at the thing that is older than the pyramids and stranger than the pyramids, and in some ways more mysterious than the pyramids, the Sphinx. It is enormous in a way that photographs do not convey. Photographs flatten it, reduce it to a view. In person, standing at the edge of the enclosure that surrounds it, the Sphinx is enormous and specific and present. The lion body stretches approximately 73 meters from paw to tail. The head, which is not original, it was recarved in antiquity, perhaps by Khafre's workers, and is proportionally too small for the body, rises perhaps 20 meters above the floor of the enclosure. The limestone it is carved from is the same limestone as the plateau itself. The Sphinx was not built from blocks brought from elsewhere, but carved from the living rock, cut from a natural knoll of the plateau, and shaped into the form of a recumbent lion with a human head. The enclosure that surrounds it was cut at the same time, quarrying out the rock on 3 sides to reveal and deepen the monument. In the darkness, the limestone is pale, almost luminous. The surface of the body is weathered, deeply weathered in a specific pattern that runs horizontally across the stone in waves and undulations that look, in the lamplight of the site, like the marks left by water. A lot of water. Water that fell a very long time ago. Let me stay with the physical object a little longer before we get to the geology, because the Sphinx itself deserves careful attention. The Sphinx is the largest monolithic statue in the world, carved from a single outcrop of bedrock rather than assembled from separate blocks. This means the Sphinx and the plateau are literally the same stone. The monument did not arrive at Giza from somewhere else. It emerged from the plateau itself, cut out of the living rock by workers who removed the surrounding material. The enclosure that surrounds the body was cut to a depth of approximately 9 meters below the surrounding plateau level. The Sphinx sits in a pit created by quarrying away the rock that once surrounded it. Some of those blocks were used to build the Sphinx temple directly in front of the paws and the Valley Temple of Khafre to the south. Both temples show the same weathering patterns as the Sphinx body, a detail significant to tonight's central argument. My name is Arthur, and tonight we are going to sit with one of the most contested questions in ancient history. Before we go further, hello to whoever is listening right now. I don't know what time it is where you are. I don't know whether you've been here from the beginning of this series or whether tonight is your first visit. Either way, welcome. If you want more videos like this, please click subscribe to show your support. A great deal of effort goes into making these videos, and simply subscribing genuinely makes a difference in keeping this channel going. And leave a comment if you feel moved to. Tell me where you are and what time it is. Now, let me tell you about the erosion. The conventional account of the Great Sphinx places its construction in the reign of the pharaoh Khafre, the builder of the second of the 3 Great Pyramids at Giza, around 2500 BCE. This dating is based on several lines of evidence. The proximity of the Sphinx to Khafre's pyramid complex, the apparent similarity between the face of the Sphinx and known representations of Khafre, a fragment of a statue of Khafre's predecessor Khufu found near the Sphinx, and a stele erected near the Sphinx that appears in a damaged passage, to mention Khafre. 2500 BCE, 4,500 years ago. An impressive antiquity by any standard, the Sphinx is older than the founding of Rome by more than 2,000 years, older than the life of Jesus by 2,500 years. But a geologist named Robert Schoch, examining the weathering patterns on the body of the Sphinx and on the walls of the enclosure that surrounds it, concluded in the early 1990s that the erosion was not consistent with 4,500 years of weathering. It was consistent with something much older. Specifically, Schoch concluded that the distinctive pattern of erosion on the Sphinx, deep vertical undulations running across the body of the monument and up the walls of the enclosure, was characteristic of water weathering, not wind weathering, and that the quantity and depth of this water weathering implied exposure to significant rainfall over an extended period. Rainfall of a kind that Egypt has not experienced since the end of the African Humid Period, approximately 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. If Schoch is right, the Sphinx is not 4,500 years old. It is older, significantly older. Old enough to have been standing in a time when this part of Egypt received regular, heavy rainfall. Old enough to predate the civilization that we have always assumed built it. Old enough, possibly, to ask the question, who built it? That is the question at the heart of tonight's journey. Not a question about aliens or lost continents or conspiracy theories. Those are not the territory we are in. A question about geology, about climate, about the specific evidence visible on the surface of the world's most famous sculpture, and about what that evidence does and does not tell us about the history of human civilization in the Nile Valley. It is a question that has been generating serious scholarly debate for more than 30 years, and it has not yet been resolved. The Sphinx is still there in the dark at Giza, with its water-worn limestone and its disproportionate head, and its long body stretched across the floor of the enclosure. Still waiting for an answer. Still asking the question. Let me set up the full context for tonight's exploration, because the Sphinx water erosion debate sits within a broader question about the deep prehistory of Egypt. A question that connects to themes we have been exploring across this series. The conventional timeline of Egyptian civilization begins with the pre-dynastic period, roughly 5,000 to 3,100 BCE, and the first dynasty of pharaohs at approximately 3,100 BCE. The Old Kingdom, the period of the Great Pyramid builders, the period that produced the Sphinx according to conventional dating, runs from approximately 2,700 to 2,200 BCE. This is an impressive depth of history, but it is a history that begins in its fully developed civilizational form relatively suddenly. The Old Kingdom Egyptians were not gradually becoming more sophisticated across the pre-dynastic period, and then reaching the level of the pyramid builders. The pyramid builders appear in the archaeological record as an already extraordinarily capable civilization. One that knew how to quarry and transport and stack enormous blocks of stone with a precision that has never been surpassed. Where did this capability come from? The conventional answer is that it developed gradually over the pre-dynastic period in ways that the archaeological record shows incompletely. The alternative that some scholars have proposed, and that the Sphinx water erosion argument supports, is that there was a significant civilization in the Nile Valley before the conventionally attested pre-dynastic period, a civilization that left the Sphinx as its most enduring monument. This is not a fringe idea. It is a serious scholarly hypothesis, supported by specific physical evidence that has been debated in peer-reviewed journals by credentialed geologists. Whether it is correct is what we are here to explore. Before we begin that exploration, let me say one more thing about the experience of the Sphinx at night. The specific quality of being present with something that is both enormously familiar and genuinely mysterious. The Sphinx is one of the most reproduced images in the world. Every child in every country who has encountered a picture book about ancient Egypt has seen the Sphinx. It appears on chocolate boxes and tourist brochures and documentaries and films and video games. It is so thoroughly present in global visual culture that it is almost impossible to see it fresh, almost impossible to encounter it without the weight of all those representations overlying the actual thing. And yet the actual thing, the limestone, the enclosure, the specific quality of the monument at night in the desert, is genuinely different from the representation. Photographs flatten it, the specific physical presence of a monument that is older than almost everything human beings have made, that has absorbed millennia of sunrises and deserts and the passing of civilizations. That presence cannot be conveyed in a photograph. When you stand at the edge of the enclosure and look down at it in the dark, what you feel is not recognition, but something closer to the opposite. The familiar image drops away and you are left with the thing itself. Enormous, ancient, specific in a way that images never are. Specific in the way that only physical matter is specific. That specificity is what tonight has been about, not the image, the thing. Let me describe the Sphinx properly. The Sphinx at Giza is a recumbent lion with a human head. Specifically, a lion lying with its front paws extended, its body elongated, its head facing due east toward the rising sun. The lion body is approximately 73 meters long and about 6 meters wide. The head is approximately 4 meters wide and rises roughly 9 meters above the shoulders. The entire monument, from the bottom of the enclosure to the top of the head, stands approximately 20 meters tall. The limestone from which the Sphinx is carved is not uniform. The Giza Plateau is built up of several distinct geological layers, each with different properties, different hardness, different porosity, different response to weathering. The body of the Sphinx is carved from the softer, more porous layers at the lower and middle levels of the plateau. The head of the Sphinx is carved from the harder, more resistant limestone near the top of the knoll from which the monument was cut. This geological heterogeneity is important for the weathering argument, which we will come back to. For now, the point is that the Sphinx is not a simple, uniform object. It is a complex carving in complex stone, and understanding its weathering requires understanding the specific properties of the specific stone in each part of the monument. The face of the Sphinx, the human head, shows extensive reworking. The proportions of the head relative to the body are wrong. The head is too small for the body. This disproportion is one of the longest recognized features of the monument and has generated extensive discussion. The most widely accepted explanation is that the head was recarved at some point in antiquity. That an original head, probably representing an animal like a ram or a jackal, was reshaped into the current human head, and that the recarving reduced its size. If this is correct, the head of the Sphinx is not original. The face we see, which is traditionally identified as Khafre, based on its supposed similarity to known representations of that pharaoh, may be a 4th dynasty recarving of a much earlier monument. The Dream Stele, erected by Thutmose IV approximately 1400 BCE, stands between the paws of the Sphinx and records a dream in which the Sphinx appeared to the young Prince Thutmose and promised him the kingship if he would clear the sand that had buried it to the neck. The stele includes a damaged line of text that some scholars have interpreted as a reference to Khafre. The cartouche that would name Khafre is damaged and only partially legible, but the interpretation is contested. The Sphinx temple, directly in front of the monument's pores, is one of the most extraordinary structures at Giza and one of the least visited. It was built from enormous limestone core blocks, many of them weighing 200 tons or more, quarried from the Sphinx enclosure itself during the creation of the monument. The blocks were then faced on the exterior with granite transported from Aswan, approximately 800 kilometers to the south. The combination of megalithic limestone core blocks with granite casing is characteristic of the oldest construction at Giza. The same combination appears in the Valley Temple of Khafre, which is also built from core blocks, quarried from the Sphinx enclosure and faced with Aswan granite. Both structures have a specific quality of massive, stark simplicity. No inscriptions, no decorative elements, just the enormous limestone blocks fitted together with extraordinary precision. This architectural style is one of the things that some scholars find puzzling about the oldest structures at Giza. It is different in character from the later Egyptian temple tradition, which is richly decorated and inscribed. The Sphinx temple and the Valley temple have no inscriptions at all. They are purely structural, purely megalithic, apparently designed for permanence and mass rather than for display or documentation. The absence of inscriptions is significant for the dating question. Most ancient Egyptian structures that can be confidently dated are dated through inscriptions. The names and titles of the pharaoh who built them, the dates of specific construction phases, the records of the workers who built them. The Sphinx temple and the Valley temple have none of this. Their dating is inferred from their association with the Sphinx and with the Khafre pyramid complex, not from any direct documentary evidence. Now let me describe the weathering more precisely, because precision matters here. The body of the Sphinx shows two distinct types of weathering. The first is the deep, wave-like vertical undulations on the body and on the walls of the enclosure. These are the weathering patterns that Schoch identifies as characteristic of water erosion, specifically of prolonged exposure to significant rainfall. The undulations are roughly horizontal in orientation, but have a specific curved, scalloped character that is different from the smooth, flat surfaces produced by wind erosion. The second type of weathering is shallower, more horizontal, and concentrated on the upper surfaces of the monument, the top of the head, the top of the back. This second type is more consistent with wind erosion and salt weathering. The distinction between these two types is important. If the Sphinx showed only the second type of weathering, the conventional dating would face no challenge. That pattern is consistent with 4,500 years of exposure in a desert environment. It is the first type, the deep, wave-like vertical undulations, that is anomalous. Schoch's argument at its core is that the first type of weathering is inconsistent with the arid climate that has characterized Egypt for the last 4,000 years, and is consistent only with a significantly wetter period that ended before the conventional date of the Sphinx's construction. This is the geological argument, and it is the argument we need to examine carefully, because if Schoch is right, the implications are significant, and if Schoch is wrong, the reasons why he is wrong are also significant. The specific truth or falsity of the argument is what matters here, not the mythology around it, not the wishful thinking, the specific geological evidence. Let me also spend time with the conventional case for Khafre's authorship, because it is important to understand what the conventional dating is based on before we examine the challenge to it. The primary evidence linking the Sphinx to Khafre is circumstantial but substantial. The Sphinx is physically part of the Khafre pyramid complex. It sits at the eastern end of the causeway that connects Khafre's pyramid to his valley temple, and it faces the same direction as the other components of the complex. The valley temple, which is connected to the Sphinx temple by a corridor, has been found to contain statues of Khafre. The famous diorite statue of Khafre with a falcon on the back of his head, now in the Cairo Museum, was found in a pit in the Valley Temple. The face of the Sphinx has been compared to other representations of Khafre by Egyptologists who have found the likeness convincing, though others find the comparison less compelling, particularly given the extensive reworking the face appears to have undergone. There is also the partially legible cartouche in the dream stele that may refer to Khafre, though the damage to the stele makes this reading uncertain. And there is the Old Kingdom inventory Stele, found at Giza in the 19th century, which mentions the Sphinx and a temple associated with it in the context of what appears to be the reign of Khufu, Khafre's predecessor. If the inventory stele is accurate, the Sphinx was already old and famous in the reign of Khufu, which would mean it predates Khafre and cannot have been built by him. The status of the inventory stele is itself a matter of debate. Mainstream Egyptology tends to dismiss it as a later document that was backdated, a document from the late period of Egyptian history, perhaps 1,000 years after the Old Kingdom, that was written to make it look as though it originated in the Old Kingdom. This dismissal may be correct, but the specific logic used to dismiss it, that it cannot be accurate because it contradicts the Khafre attribution, is circular if the Khafre attribution is itself what is being questioned. The conventional dating of the Sphinx to Khafre is based on association and circumstantial evidence. It is the most parsimonious explanation of the available archaeological evidence. But it is not proven in the way that datings based on direct inscriptions or independently dated construction records would be proven. The absence of a direct inscription linking Khafre to the Sphinx, the absence of the kind of record that exists for many other ancient Egyptian monuments, leaves the dating in a state of evidential uncertainty that is sometimes obscured by the confidence with which the Khafre attribution is stated in popular accounts. The Khafre attribution is the best current explanation of the archaeological evidence. It is not a fact beyond dispute. And the geological evidence that Schoch has brought to bear is a genuine challenge to it, a challenge that must be addressed on its merits rather than dismissed because it is inconvenient. That is the intellectual situation we are in, and it is one that deserves more careful attention than it usually receives. Let me add one more element to this portrait of the monument before we move to the geological argument, the question of the nose. The Sphinx's nose is missing. The face of the monument, already proportionally small for the body and apparently recarved in antiquity, is further distorted by the absence of the nose. A substantial piece of carved limestone that would have projected from the center of the face, and that at some point in the monument's long history was removed. The popular story is that Napoleon's artillery used the Sphinx as target practice and shot off the nose. This story is false. It persists in popular culture despite having been definitively refuted by the evidence. Drawings of the Sphinx made before Napoleon's Egyptian campaign show the nose already missing. An Egyptian historian writing in the 15th century, the Mamluk scholar al-Makrizi, records that a Sufi fanatic named Muhammad Sa'im al-Dar destroyed the nose in 1378 CE, more than 4 centuries before Napoleon arrived. The missing nose is a reminder that the Sphinx we see today is not the Sphinx as it was made. It has been modified, damaged, repaired, recarved, buried, cleared, buried again and cleared again across its long history. The layers of its visual history are difficult to disentangle. What we see when we look at the Sphinx is not the pristine original, but the product of thousands of years of use and exposure and modification. This layering of history is characteristic of all very ancient monuments. They are never simply themselves. They are always also everything that has happened to them. The Sphinx is simultaneously the original carved rock, and the recarved face, and the missing nose, and the accumulated sand of centuries, and the restoration work of modern Egyptian authorities who have patched deteriorating sections with cement and stone. Understanding the Sphinx requires holding all these layers simultaneously. The geological question, when was the original carved, is a question about one specific layer of that history, a layer that may be the deepest layer of all. Let me tell you how the water erosion argument came to be. The story begins not with a geologist, but with a writer. John Anthony West was an American author and independent Egyptologist, not a credentialed academic, but a deeply read and serious student of ancient Egypt who had spent decades studying the work of the French mathematician and Egyptologist R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch. Schwaller de Lubitsch had spent 15 years at Karnak in the 1930s and 1940s, studying the great temple complex there, and had published a monumental work arguing that ancient Egyptian civilization was far more sophisticated in its philosophy and its science than conventional Egyptology recognized. His work was not primarily about the Sphinx. It was about the symbolism and the sacred geometry of Egyptian temples. But in the course of his analysis, he made an observation that West would later seize upon. Schwaller de Lubitsch noted that the body of the Sphinx appeared to show erosion from water rather than from wind and sand. He did not develop this observation into a full argument. He mentioned it in passing, as one detail among many in a much larger work. But West read it and understood its potential significance. If the Sphinx showed water erosion, and if Egypt had been an arid desert for the last 4,000 years, then the water erosion had to predate the arid period. And the arid period in the Nile Valley had begun before the conventional date of the Sphinx's construction, which would mean the Sphinx was older than conventionally dated. West knew he was not a geologist. He understood that to make this argument credible, he needed the support of a professional geologist who could analyze the weathering patterns on the Sphinx and provide an authoritative scientific opinion. In the late 1980s, he approached Robert Schoch. Robert Schoch was at that time a young associate professor in the College of General Studies at Boston University, with a PhD in geology and geophysics from Yale. He was a working scientist with legitimate credentials in precisely the relevant field. He agreed to visit Giza and examine the Sphinx. What Schoch found when he examined the Sphinx confirmed West's intuition, but gave it a specific scientific grounding that West's literary analysis could not provide. Schoch's examination focused on two specific features of the weathering. The first was the profile of the erosion on the body of the Sphinx and on the walls of the enclosure. The second was the subsurface geology revealed by seismic analysis he conducted at the site. The profile of the erosion is the central evidence. Schoch observed that the body of the Sphinx and the walls of the enclosure show a specific pattern of erosion that he describes as undulating, wave-like, with rounded vertical channels running down the faces of the stone. This pattern, Schoch argued, is diagnostic of water weathering. Specifically, it is characteristic of the erosion produced by water running down a vertical face. Rainwater running down the walls of the enclosure, cutting channels as it descends. This is a specific technical claim. Water erosion and wind erosion produce different surface textures on limestone. Wind erosion in a desert environment tends to produce smooth, horizontal surfaces as the wind-driven sand abrades the stone preferentially at the windward face. Water erosion tends to produce vertical channels and undulating surfaces as water runs down the stone face. exploiting weaknesses in the rock. The surfaces of the Sphinx body and the enclosure walls show the second pattern, not the first. Schoch argued that no amount of wind erosion could produce the specific profile he observed. Only prolonged exposure to significant rainfall could have done it. The second line of evidence came from seismic analysis. Schoch and his colleague Thomas Göbekli conducted seismic refraction surveys around the Sphinx, a technique that uses sound waves to probe the subsurface geology. The survey revealed that the rock directly beneath and around the Sphinx shows a specific pattern of subsurface weathering. The depth of weathering is greater on the west side of the enclosure than on the east side. This asymmetry is significant. The prevailing wind at Giza comes from the north and northwest. If the weathering were primarily wind-driven, you would expect the north and northwest faces to show more weathering than the south and southeast faces. The windward sides would be more eroded. Instead, the deeper weathering is on the west side, which is consistent with water infiltration driven by rainfall and the specific geology of the plateau, rather than with wind erosion. Schoch also noted that the seismic data suggested the rock directly beneath the Sphinx had been weathered to a significantly greater depth than the rock immediately outside the enclosure. If the weathering were primarily from surface wind and sand, you would not expect this subsurface pattern. But if the weathering were from rainfall, water infiltrating downward into the rock over a long period. The deeper weathering beneath the protected floor of the enclosure makes sense. In 1992, Schoch presented his findings at the annual meeting of the Geological Society of America. This was a major professional venue, a gathering of thousands of credentialed geologists. His presentation attracted immediate attention and immediate controversy. The specific argument Schoch made at the GSA was that the weathering profiles he had documented were consistent with weathering that had occurred before approximately 5000 BCE, before the conventional date of the Sphinx's construction. The depth of the weathering, combined with what was known about the rates of limestone weathering under different climatic conditions, suggested that the Sphinx had been exposed to significant rainfall for a period substantially longer than 4,500 years. He proposed that the body of the Sphinx was carved in its original form sometime between 7000 and 5000 BCE, before the arid period that has characterized Egypt since then. The head may have been recarved later, possibly in the 4th dynasty, when Khafre's workers reshaped an existing monument into the current form. The GSA audience included Egyptologists as well as geologists. The Egyptologists in attendance were largely hostile. Dr. Zahi Hawass, then and for many years afterward the most prominent figure in Egyptian archaeology, argued that there was no archaeological evidence for a complex society in Egypt capable of carving the Sphinx at the dates Schoch proposed. A monument of that scale required an organized state, sophisticated quarrying technology, and a large workforce. No archaeological evidence of such a society existed in Egypt at 7000 BCE. Schoch's response was that the absence of evidence was not evidence of absence, that a civilization capable of carving the Sphinx might have left traces that had not yet been found, or that had been destroyed by subsequent occupation of the site. The debate was vigorous and public, and it attracted media attention that brought the water erosion hypothesis to a wide audience. The 1992 GSA presentation marked the moment when the Sphinx water erosion debate became a mainstream scholarly controversy rather than a fringe speculation. Whatever one thinks of Schoch's conclusions, his credentials, and the rigor of his geological analysis meant that the argument had to be taken seriously and addressed on its merits. And it has been. The subsequent 30 years of debate have produced a substantial body of literature responding to Schoch's argument, both supporting and criticizing it. We will explore the main lines of that debate in the parts of tonight's journey that follow. For now, let me dwell a little more on the specific quality of Schoch's geological argument, because it is worth understanding in some depth before we consider the counter-arguments. The core of Schoch's case is that the specific morphology, the specific three-dimensional shape, of the weathering on the Sphinx body and enclosure walls is characteristic of water weathering and inconsistent with wind weathering. This is not a claim that requires special expertise to grasp intuitively. If you look at a limestone cliff that has been exposed to rain for a long time, and then look at a limestone surface that has been exposed to wind-blown sand, they look different. The first has vertical channels, undulating surfaces, rounded profiles. The second is smoother, more abraded, with a characteristic surface texture produced by the scouring action of sand. The Sphinx enclosure walls look like the first type, not the second. Schoch has presented this argument in multiple peer-reviewed publications, in detailed geological reports, and in public forums. He has responded to specific criticisms and refined his argument in response to the best objections. His case is not a casual assertion. It is a sustained, detailed, scientifically grounded argument that has evolved over 30 years of engagement with critics. Whether the argument is ultimately correct is a question we will examine carefully. But it is a question that deserves the specific quality of attention that a serious scientific argument deserves. Not dismissal, not credulity. Careful attention to the evidence. Let me also spend time with the specific intellectual context in which Schoch's argument appeared, because it matters for understanding how it was received and why the controversy it generated was so heated. By the early 1990s, the study of ancient Egypt had developed into a mature academic discipline with established methods, established conclusions, and a strong professional culture that tended to be protective of the consensus view. Egyptology is in some respects a closed field. Access to the major sites is controlled, the number of people who can work with primary sources is limited, and the professional reputation of its practitioners depends heavily on the approval of the field's senior figures. Schoch came from outside this field. He was a geologist, not an Egyptologist. His primary training was in the analysis of rocks and minerals and geological processes, not in the decipherment of hieroglyphs or the analysis of pottery sequences. When he walked onto the Giza Plateau and started making claims about the age of the Sphinx based on geological evidence, he was, from the perspective of the Egyptological establishment, a trespasser. This is not a fair characterization of what he was doing. The age of a stone monument is a geological question as much as an archaeological one. The weathering of limestone is within the competence of a geologist. The application of seismic refraction techniques to subsurface analysis is standard geological methodology. Schoch was applying his professional expertise to a problem that genuinely fell within the scope of his discipline. But the territorial response of the Egyptological establishment is understandable even if it is not entirely justified. The conventional dating of the Sphinx is one of the most important dates in the conventional chronology of ancient Egypt. If it is wrong, if the Sphinx is significantly older than thought, the implications extend far beyond the Sphinx itself. The conventional story of Egyptian civilization of the Old Kingdom as the period in which the great monuments at Giza were built would require fundamental revision. The stakes for Egyptology as a discipline were, therefore, very high, and the natural response to a high-stakes challenge from outside the discipline was to marshal the field's resources against it. Hawas's response at the 1992 GSA meeting was the opening shot in what became a sustained campaign to discredit Schoch's argument. The specific form of the counter-argument, that there was no archaeological evidence for a complex society in Egypt at the dates Schoch proposed, is worth examining carefully because it is the strongest and most substantive objection to the water erosion hypothesis. The argument from the absence of archaeological evidence is powerful. For the Sphinx to have been carved in 7000 BCE or earlier, a society capable of organizing and executing the quarrying operation had to exist. The Sphinx is not a small or simple monument. It required planning, organization, sustained labor, and the specific technical knowledge of how to quarry and shape limestone on a large scale. These are the capabilities of a complex, organized society, not of isolated groups of hunter-gatherers. And the archaeological record of Egypt in 7000 BCE shows nothing of the kind. What the record shows is a dispersed population of pastoralists and incipient farmers, beginning the transition to sedentary agriculture but without the organizational complexity required to build a monument of the Sphinx's scale. This is not a minor objection. It is a serious challenge to the implications of Schoch's geological argument, even if it does not directly address the geological evidence itself. Schoch's response, that the absence of evidence for a pre-dynastic complex society is evidence of absence only if we assume we have found all the relevant evidence, is philosophically sound but empirically weak. We cannot simply posit a complex society that left no archaeological trace. Complex societies leave traces. They make pottery, build structures, bury their dead in specific ways, leave the residues of their material culture. Unless, of course, the traces are there but have not yet been found, or the traces were destroyed by the subsequent occupation of the site, or the complex society in question was unusual in some way that produced fewer traces than we would normally expect. These possibilities are not impossible, but they are increasingly speculative as the archaeological evidence against them accumulates. The specific tension between Schoch's geological argument and the archaeological silence is the central intellectual problem of the water erosion debate. The geological evidence points one way, the archaeological evidence points another. Both lines of evidence need to be taken seriously. The resolution, if there is one, requires finding a way to reconcile them. We will explore the attempts at resolution in the parts of tonight's journey that follow. But let me close this part by noting something about the quality of the debate itself. The water erosion controversy produced a specific kind of scholarly engagement, heated, personal, sometimes professionally damaging for those involved, that is itself worth reflecting on. Schoch's argument was attacked not just on its merits but on the grounds of his association with West, who was not a credentialed academic and who had come to the question through an interest in alternative history that some mainstream scholars found disreputable. The quality of an argument should be assessed on its merits, not on the reputation of those who make it. But in practice, scientific communities are human communities, and reputational factors influence how arguments are received. Schoch has maintained his argument, refined it, and defended it for more than 30 years against sustained professional criticism. That persistence from someone with real credentials in the relevant field is itself evidence that the argument is not as easily dismissed as the Egyptological establishment would prefer. The question remains open, the evidence remains contested, and the Sphinx remains in the desert, weathered in ways that do not fit neatly into either the conventional story or the alternative one. Let me try to give you a more precise sense of what Schoch's proposed timeline actually looks like, because the dates he proposes are often stated loosely in popular accounts, and precision matters here. Schoch's original 1992 proposal was that the oldest portions of the Sphinx body were carved between approximately 7,000 and 5,000 BCE, a range he has since extended in his more recent work to as early as 10,000 BCE, based on additional analysis of the depth of weathering and more refined estimates of limestone weathering rates under different climatic conditions. This is not a single date, it is a range, and the range spans a period that straddles the transition from the end of the last ice age through the African Humid Period. The earlier end of the range, 10,000 BCE, falls within the period sometimes called the Younger Dryas, a temporary return to cold, wet conditions in the aftermath of the last glacial maximum. The later end, 5,000 BCE, falls in the late African Humid Period, after which the Sahara began its transition to the arid desert we know today. What Schoch is proposing, at his most conservative, is that the Sphinx was standing and being rained on for several thousand years before the pharaoh Khafre was born. At his most expansive, the Sphinx was already ancient by the time the first pharaohs unified Egypt. The difference between these scenarios matters. A Sphinx dating to 5,000 BCE is ancient, but not impossibly so. It falls within a period when the Egyptian pre-dynastic culture was already developing, and a modest upward revision of its sophistication might be accommodated within the existing framework. A Sphinx dating to 10,000 BCE is a different matter entirely. It would place a major monument in the Nile Valley at a time when no complex society anywhere in the world is known to have existed. Schoch himself has been careful about the implications of the older date estimates, acknowledging that they would require a significant revision of the conventional picture of prehistoric human capability. He does not claim that the builders of the original Sphinx were as sophisticated as the Old Kingdom Egyptians. He proposes something more modest, that a relatively sophisticated society existed in the Nile Valley earlier than the conventional record shows, capable of organized quarrying, if not of the full range of architectural achievements the Old Kingdom produced. This is a significant but not impossibly radical claim. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a complex of monumental stone structures dated to approximately 10,000 BCE, built by hunter-gatherers who were more capable than the conventional model had assumed, has made the idea of pre-agricultural organized construction less implausible than it seemed in 1992. Schoch has pointed to Göbekli Tepe repeatedly in his more recent discussions of the Sphinx, noting that it demonstrates the existence of complex, organized construction at exactly the period his dating proposes for the original Sphinx carving. The two sites are not directly connected. They are separated by thousands of kilometers and involve different technologies and different cultural contexts. But they are at least consistent with a picture of the world in which the conventional timeline of complex human organization needs revision. The geological argument, the archaeological silence, the parallel evidence from Göbekli Tepe. These are the threads of the debate. We will pull each of them carefully in the parts that follow. Let me explain the geology properly. The distinction between water erosion and wind erosion on limestone is not arcane. It is something that geologists can observe, measure, and characterize with considerable precision, because the two processes leave different fingerprints on the stone they act upon. Understanding those fingerprints, understanding what each type of erosion looks like and why it looks that way, is essential for evaluating Schoch's argument. Wind erosion in a desert environment works primarily through abrasion. Wind carries sand and fine particles, and when those particles strike a rock surface, they abrade it, wearing away the material through the cumulative effect of millions of small impacts. The abrasion is most effective at and near the ground level, where the concentration of wind-carried particles is highest, and it tends to produce smooth, polished surfaces with a specific texture that geologists call ventifacted, the same process that produces the smooth, faceted surfaces of desert pebbles. Wind erosion also exploits horizontal weaknesses in the rock, the bedding planes where softer and harder layers of limestone alternate, more effectively than vertical weaknesses. The result is a characteristic pattern of horizontal layering in the erosion profile, with softer horizontal layers worn back further than the harder layers above and below them. This produces a stepped or layered appearance on a limestone face that has been subjected to prolonged wind erosion. Water erosion on a vertical limestone face works differently. Rain falling on stone dissolves the calcium carbonate of the limestone through a weak acid reaction. Rainwater picks up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and becomes slightly acidic, and this acid slowly dissolves the limestone surface. More importantly, water running down a vertical face exploits vertical fractures and weaknesses in the rock, cutting channels downward as it flows. The channels widen over time as more water flows through them, producing the characteristic undulating wave-like profile that Schoch identifies on the Sphinx enclosure walls. The key diagnostic difference is the orientation of the erosion patterns. Wind erosion produces primarily horizontal patterns, following the horizontal bedding of the limestone. Water erosion produces primarily vertical patterns following the flow of water down the face of the stone. The Sphinx enclosure walls show primarily vertical patterns. This is the core of the observational evidence. When you look at the walls of the enclosure, the surface is exposed when the rock was quarried away to create the pit in which the Sphinx sits. You see deep, rounded, vertical channels running from top to bottom. These channels are not uniform. They vary in depth and width, reflecting variations in the hardness and composition of the limestone. But they are consistently vertical in their orientation. This pattern is not what you would expect from wind erosion. Wind erosion in the Giza area would produce horizontal patterns following the bedding planes. The vertical pattern requires a process that runs vertically down the face of the stone, which means water. Now let me be precise about an important nuance in this argument, because critics have raised it and it deserves careful consideration. Some geologists have argued that the vertical weathering patterns on the Sphinx could be explained by a process other than rainfall: salt weathering. Salt weathering occurs when salts dissolved in groundwater or carried by capillary action migrate through porous rock and crystallize near the surface as the water evaporates. The crystallization of salts exerts mechanical stress on the rock, breaking it apart and eventually producing deep pitting and channeling. The argument is that the Giza Plateau is rich in subsurface salts, that these salts could have migrated through the porous limestone of the Sphinx body and enclosure walls over thousands of years, and that the resulting salt weathering could produce weathering profiles similar to what Schoch attributes to rainfall. Schoch has addressed this objection in detail. He acknowledges that salt weathering is a real process that affects the Sphinx. The surface of the monument shows salt efflorescence in places, the specific white crystalline deposits that form when salt-laden water evaporates at the surface. But he argues that salt weathering produces a different morphology from what is observed on the Sphinx enclosure walls. Salt weathering tends to produce pitting and flaking, a granular disintegration of the surface, rather than the deep, rounded, channel-like undulations that are the primary weathering pattern on the enclosure walls. He also points to the spatial distribution of the weathering as evidence against the salt hypothesis. The deepest, most extensive weathering on the Sphinx is on the body and the lower enclosure walls, not on the upper parts of the enclosure, which are more exposed to wind and more accessible to salt-laden moisture from above. If salt weathering were the primary process, you would expect the upper surfaces to show more weathering, not less. The debate between the rainfall hypothesis and the salt weathering hypothesis is a technical one, and its resolution requires the kind of detailed petrographic analysis, examination of rock samples under magnification to characterize the specific texture and composition of the weathered surfaces, that not all of the participants in the debate have conducted or published. Schoch has argued that his analysis, including examination of surface samples, is consistent with the rainfall hypothesis and inconsistent with salt weathering as the primary explanation. His critics have argued the opposite. The resolution of this specific technical dispute is important for the overall argument, and it is one of the areas where more detailed analysis could, in principle, produce a clearer answer. Now let me turn to the seismic evidence, which is in some respects the most technically compelling part of Schoch's argument, because it addresses the subsurface geology in a way that surface observation cannot. Seismic refraction is a standard geological technique. You generate a seismic wave, in Schoch's case by striking the ground with a sledgehammer, and measure how the wave travels through the subsurface using an array of geophones placed at known distances from the source. The speed at which the seismic wave travels through the rock depends on the density and rigidity of the rock. Weathered, fractured rock transmits seismic waves more slowly than solid, unweathered rock. By mapping the seismic velocities across the Sphinx enclosure, Schoch and his colleague Thomas Göbekli were able to characterize the depth of weathering at different points around the monument. The results showed a clear pattern. The rock beneath the floor of the Sphinx enclosure, the rock that has been protected from surface processes by the monument itself, is weathered to a significantly greater depth than the rock immediately outside the enclosure. This subsurface weathering depth is important because it provides an independent line of evidence for the age of the weathering. If the weathering of the Sphinx enclosure floor was produced by the same processes that weathered the walls, by rainfall penetrating down into the rock, then the depth of the subsurface weathering provides information about how long the weathering process operated. The seismic data also showed an asymmetry in the weathering depth around the monument. The west side of the enclosure shows deeper weathering than the east side. This asymmetry has been interpreted by Schoch as evidence of the direction of the water flow that produced the weathering. Water flowing from higher ground to the west and infiltrating into the enclosure more extensively on the western side. Critics have offered alternative explanations for the seismic asymmetry. Differences in the original geology of the limestone on the two sides of the enclosure, for instance. But Schoch has argued that these alternative explanations do not fully account for the specific pattern he observed, and that the most parsimonious explanation remains the one he originally proposed: prolonged water infiltration from rainfall. Let me now try to characterize what the specific rainfall conditions implied by the erosion would look like. The erosion visible on the Sphinx body and enclosure walls is not the product of a single rain event, or even of a single unusually wet season. It is the product of prolonged, repeated, heavy rainfall over an extended period. The kind of rainfall that characterizes a semi-arid or seasonally wet climate, not a desert. Schoch estimates that the depth of weathering on the enclosure walls implies at least several thousand years of significant rainfall. He has calibrated this estimate against the known weathering rates of similar limestone under similar rainfall conditions in other parts of the world. The weathering of limestone in regions with a Mediterranean or subtropical climate that has been studied by geomorphologists. The specific rainfall amount and duration implied by the erosion is difficult to quantify precisely because limestone weathering rates depend on many variables: the specific chemistry of the limestone, the temperature of the water, the frequency and intensity of the rainfall, and other factors. But the general picture is clear. The weathering requires a climate substantially wetter than anything Egypt has experienced in the last 4,000 years. This is the geological claim that connects to the climate history of Egypt. And the climate history is the next thread we need to pull. How wet was Egypt, and when? The answer to that question is where the geological argument meets the paleoclimatological record. And the paleoclimatological record has something specific to say. But before we turn to the climate record, let me spend more time with the physical appearance of water-weathered versus wind-weathered limestone, because this is the kind of evidence that anyone can, in principle, evaluate, not through laboratory analysis, but through observation. There is a thought experiment that helps make the distinction vivid. Imagine two limestone walls, each exposed for 4,000 years. The first wall is in the Sahara Desert, experiencing the wind-driven sand erosion that characterizes that environment. The second wall is in a coastal Mediterranean environment, experiencing regular rainfall over the same period. The first wall will be abraded smoothly, with its horizontal bedding planes emphasized. The softer layers worn back further than the harder ones, producing a slightly stepped profile when you look at it from the side. The surface will have a specific texture, slightly polished, with fine pitting from the sand impacts, but without the deep, rounded channels of water erosion. The second wall will look dramatically different. The face will be marked by deep, rounded channels running vertically, some narrow, some broad, following the vertical fractures in the limestone. Between the channels, the surface will be rounded and curved rather than flat, because the water dissolves the calcium carbonate of the limestone, preferentially where it pools and flows. The overall impression is of a surface that has been sculpted from within as much as from outside. The walls of the Sphinx enclosure look like the second wall, not the first. This observational claim that the morphology of the weathering is water type rather than wind type is the foundation of Schoch's argument, and is what he has consistently returned to when critics propose alternative explanations. The salt weathering hypothesis, the wind erosion hypothesis, the chemical weathering hypothesis. Each of them, Schoch argues, produces a different morphology from what is actually observed on the enclosure walls. A specific piece of comparative evidence that Schoch has used is the weathering of tombs cut into the Giza Plateau during the Old Kingdom. Tombs that can be securely dated to the reign of specific pharaohs. These tombs show wind erosion patterns, not water erosion patterns. The same limestone in the same environment, over 4,000 years of desert exposure, has weathered differently from the Sphinx enclosure walls. The comparison is powerful because it controls for the variable of time. If the Sphinx were the same age as the Old Kingdom tombs, it should show the same kind of weathering. It shows different weathering. The difference implies a different weathering history. Specifically, a period of water erosion that the Old Kingdom tombs did not experience because they were cut after the wet period ended. This comparative evidence is one of the clearest ways to state the argument. The Sphinx is not weathered the way other things at Giza that are confidently dated to 2500 BCE are weathered. It is weathered differently. And the most straightforward explanation of the difference is age, that the Sphinx is older and was exposed to a wetter climate. Critics have responded to this comparative evidence in two main ways. The first is to argue that the Sphinx enclosure was specifically susceptible to water effects that the tombs were not, that the geometry of the enclosure created conditions for water accumulation and runoff that amplified the weathering effects beyond what the simple exposure time would predict. The enclosure is, after all, a pit. Water flowing across the plateau would naturally collect in the enclosure, and the concentrated flow of collected water could produce more intense erosion than the same amount of water distributed over a flat surface. Schoch acknowledges this effect, but argues that it cannot fully account for the scale and depth of the weathering observed. Even accounting for the concentration of runoff in the enclosure, the weathering is deeper than 4,000 years of occasional rainfall events would produce. The second response is to argue that the different weathering of the Sphinx and the Old Kingdom tombs reflects different geological properties of the limestone in which they are cut, rather than different ages or different weathering histories. The Sphinx body is carved in a particularly soft and porous layer of limestone, while some of the Old Kingdom tombs are cut in harder layers. The softer limestone would weather more quickly under any given conditions. Schoch has addressed this argument by pointing out that the enclosure walls, the surfaces cut in the hard limestone of the plateau, also show the water weathering pattern, not just the soft limestone of the Sphinx body. The weathering is not confined to the soft rock. It is present throughout the enclosure. These technical exchanges have continued for more than 3 decades, accumulating a body of detailed geological argument that is not easily summarized, but that remains unresolved. Neither side has produced evidence so compelling that the other has conceded. This is the honest state of the geology. Not a clear victory for Schoch, not a clear refutation. A genuine scientific dispute between people with different interpretations of the same physical evidence, involving technical questions about limestone weathering that are genuinely difficult to resolve without more detailed analysis than either side has yet published. The debate deserves that analysis. The Sphinx deserves that analysis. And the question of what weathered those walls, and when, deserves a better answer than the current state of the argument provides. Let me spend a moment on the specific way the geological evidence interacts with our prior expectations about ancient Egypt, because this interaction is part of why the debate has been so heated. When a geologist examines a rock face and concludes that it was water eroded, they are doing something that is, in principle, value neutral. Identifying a physical process from its physical traces. The conclusion that the Sphinx enclosure was water eroded does not, by itself, say anything about who built the Sphinx or when. Geology does not do history. It describes physical processes and their timing. What those physical processes mean for our understanding of human history is a separate question. The reason the geological argument has become so charged is precisely because the geological conclusion, the enclosure shows water erosion, has specific historical implications given what we know about Egyptian climate history. If the only period when the Giza Plateau received enough rainfall to produce the observed erosion was before approximately 5000 BCE, then the erosion was produced before 5000 BCE. And if the erosion was produced before 5000 BCE, the monument that the erosion is on must have been standing before 5000 BCE. And if the monument was standing before 5000 BCE, it predates conventional Egyptian civilization by a significant margin. This chain of reasoning is valid, but it contains multiple links, each of which can be questioned. The climate history of Egypt is itself a matter of active research, with some uncertainty. The relationship between rainfall amount and limestone weathering rate is not perfectly characterized. The specific conditions that pertained in the Sphinx enclosure over the last 10,000 years may have differed from the general regional climate in ways that matter for the weathering rate. Each of these links in the chain deserves scrutiny. Schoch's argument is strong. It is based on genuine geological expertise applied to real physical evidence, but it is not invulnerable. The specific objections to each link in the chain are real objections that require real answers. What is not acceptable, intellectually, is to dismiss the argument because its conclusions are inconvenient. The specific resistance from the Egyptological establishment that Schoch has encountered is at least partly driven by the inconvenience of the conclusions rather than by the technical inadequacy of the argument. That is not how scientific disputes should be resolved. The argument should stand or fall on the geology, on the specific morphology of the weathering, the seismic data, the comparative analysis with securely dated monuments, the climate history. Those are the things that matter, and those are the things we will continue to examine. Let me tell you about the Green Sahara. The Sahara Desert is the largest hot desert on Earth. It spans approximately 9 million square kilometers across northern Africa, from the Atlantic coast to the Red Sea, encompassing parts of 11 modern countries. It is defined by extreme aridity. Annual rainfall in most of the Sahara is less than 25 millimeters, and in the hyper-arid core of the desert, it may fall to less than 5 millimeters per year. The Sahara is one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth for complex life. It was not always this way. Between approximately 11,000 and 5,000 BCE, a period that geologists and paleoclimatologists call the African Humid Period, or sometimes the Green Sahara, the climate of northern Africa was dramatically different from today. Monsoon rains extended much further north than they do now, driven by changes in the Earth's orbital geometry that increased the amount of solar energy reaching the northern hemisphere in summer. The rains that today fall only as far north as the Sahel, the semi-arid belt south of the Sahara, extended across what is now desert, reaching the Mediterranean coast and watering the entire breadth of northern Africa. During the African Humid Period, the Sahara was not a desert, it was a savanna. The rock art found across the Sahara, in the Tassili Naja Plateau in Algeria, in the Fezzan region of Libya, in the Tibesti Mountains of Chad, records a world of grasslands and wetlands, of rivers and lakes, of hippopotamuses and crocodiles and cattle and human herders. The art is vivid and abundant, covering thousands of rock surfaces across a region that is now almost entirely devoid of life. The paleoclimatological evidence for the African Humid Period is comprehensive and well established. Lake sediment cores from across the Sahara record the presence of lakes that existed during the humid period and dried up as the climate shifted back toward aridity. Pollen records from those sediments show the presence of grassland and woodland vegetation. Fossil river channels, wadis that now carry water only in the rarest of rainstorms, record the drainage systems of a wetter landscape. The transition out of the African Humid Period was not abrupt everywhere. In some regions, the shift from humid to arid conditions happened gradually over centuries. In others, particularly in the eastern Sahara, including the region that is now Egypt, the transition appears to have been relatively rapid, occurring within a few centuries around 5,500 to 5,000 BCE. This timing is central to Schoch's argument. If the African Humid Period ended in the eastern Sahara around 5000 BCE, then the last time the Giza Plateau received significant regular rainfall was before 5000 BCE. And if the Sphinx shows erosion that required significant regular rainfall to produce, that erosion must have been produced before 5000 BCE. The conventional dating of the Sphinx, 2500 BCE, places it more than 2000 years after the end of the period when the climate could have produced the erosion Schoch describes. In the conventional chronology, the Sphinx was built in an already arid Egypt, into which the heavy rainfall required to produce the observed water erosion had not penetrated for at least 2000 years. This is the specific contradiction that Schoch's argument creates. Either the water erosion on the Sphinx was produced by a climate that ended before the Sphinx was conventionally built, which means the Sphinx is older than thought, or the water erosion was produced by something other than rainfall, which means the geological argument is wrong. There is no third option that preserves both the conventional dating and Schoch's geological identification of the erosion as water type. Let me now go into more detail about the African Humid Period and what it actually looked like in Egypt, because the general picture of a wetter Sahara needs to be made specific to the Giza region for the argument to work. The Giza Plateau sits at the eastern margin of the Sahara on the western edge of the Nile Valley. Its climate today is dominated by the hyper-arid conditions of the eastern Sahara. Annual rainfall in the Cairo area is typically less than 25 millimeters, and most years see less than 10 millimeters. The Nile provides the only significant water in the region. Without it, the area would be as barren as the rest of the eastern Sahara. During the African Humid Period, the climate at Giza would have been significantly wetter. The paleohydrological evidence from the eastern Sahara suggests that the region received enough rainfall to support grassland vegetation and to maintain perennial streams and seasonal lakes. Annual rainfall estimates for the humid period in this region range from a few hundred to perhaps 500 millimeters per year, comparable to the present-day Mediterranean climate of the North African coast. This is enough rainfall to produce significant water erosion on exposed limestone. Mediterranean climate rainfall, falling on a limestone outcrop over several thousand years, would produce exactly the kind of vertical channel weathering that Schoch observes on the Sphinx enclosure walls. The African Humid Period therefore provides the specific climatic conditions required by Schoch's argument. The question is whether those conditions coincided with the Sphinx's existence, whether the Sphinx was standing and exposed to this rainfall during the humid period. If the Sphinx was built before the humid period ended, the answer is yes. If it was built after, the answer is no. The conventional dating, 2500 BCE, places it after. Schoch's revised dating, 7000 to 5000 BCE at the minimum, places it during or before the end of the humid period. His more expansive proposals, 10,000 BCE or earlier, place the original carving in the early humid period or before it. Now let me complicate this picture slightly, because the paleoclimatology of the Giza region during the African Humid Period is not perfectly characterized, and there are aspects of the climate history that add nuance to the simple picture I have been presenting. The African Humid Period was not uniformly wet throughout its duration. Paleoclimatological records from across northern Africa show significant variability within the humid period. Wet intervals, dry intervals, periods of increased rainfall, and periods of reduced rainfall. The transition into and out of the humid period was not a single sharp boundary, but a zone of variability during which the climate shifted back and forth before settling into its new state. This variability means that the effective duration of the rainfall that could have produced the Sphinx erosion is not simply the full span of the African Humid Period. It is the duration of the wet intervals within that period that delivered significant rainfall to the Giza Plateau. Schoch has incorporated this complexity into his more recent analyses, acknowledging that the weathering estimate is not a simple function of total years of rainfall, but depends on the specific rainfall history of the region during the period in question. His conclusion that the erosion requires an extended period of significant rainfall that ended at or before the end of the African Humid Period is robust to this nuance. There is also evidence from other aspects of the Giza Plateau geology that the region experienced significant water flow during the humid period. The limestone of the plateau shows evidence of water table fluctuations, changes in the level of the groundwater that are consistent with significant recharge from rainfall during the humid period. This subsurface evidence is independent of the surface weathering argument and provides a complementary line of evidence for significant water activity on the plateau. The climate history, in other words, is consistent with Schoch's argument. The African Humid Period provided the conditions that Schoch's weathering interpretation requires. The timing of the end of those conditions, approximately 5000 BCE in the Eastern Sahara, is consistent with a dating of the Sphinx's original construction to before that date. What the climate history cannot do by itself is prove that the Sphinx is ancient. It can only establish that the conditions required for the erosion existed in the right time period. The erosion itself and the geological analysis of the erosion are what connect the climate history to the Sphinx's age. But the climate history removes one possible objection to Schoch's argument, the objection that the conditions he proposes never existed. They did exist. The African Humid Period is real and well documented. The Giza Plateau was wetter during the humid period. The specific rainfall conditions required to produce the observed erosion were present in this region between approximately 11,000 and 5,000 BCE. Whether the Sphinx was there to be rained on during that period is the question. And answering that question requires turning from the climate science back to the archaeology. Back to the silence in the record. Back to the absence of evidence for a complex society at the dates Schoch proposes. And back to the most uncomfortable question in this entire debate. What does that silence actually mean? Let me approach that silence carefully, because it is genuinely important and genuinely difficult. The absence of archaeological evidence for a complex society in Egypt before approximately 4000 BCE is not a trivial obstacle for Schoch's hypothesis. It is not a gap in the record that reflects inadequate excavation. Egypt has been one of the most intensively excavated regions on Earth for more than 2 centuries. The Nile Valley has been combed by archaeologists from every major nation with an interest in antiquities. The Giza Plateau itself has been studied, mapped, and excavated more thoroughly than almost any comparably sized area on the planet. And the evidence from that intensive excavation tells a consistent story. The pre-dynastic period, the period before the unification of Egypt under the first pharaoh, around 3100 BCE, shows a gradual development of social complexity, agricultural settlement, and technological capability from roughly 5000 BCE onward. Before 5000 BCE, the evidence for permanent settlement in the Nile Valley is sparse. Before 7000 BCE, the evidence for any complex organized activity in the region that would later become Egypt is essentially absent. If a society capable of carving the Sphinx existed in the Nile Valley at 7000 BCE or earlier, it left no pottery in the middens, no bones in the burials, no stone tools in the campsites, no traces of the settlement patterns that complex societies invariably produce. It vanished so completely that 2 centuries of intensive archaeology have found nothing. Schoch's response, that the builders of the original Sphinx need not have been as sophisticated as the Old Kingdom pyramid builders, and that a more modest early society might have left fewer traces, is reasonable as far as it goes. But carving the Sphinx required significant organizational capacity even in its most basic form. The quarrying operation alone required the coordination of a substantial workforce over an extended period. And workforces require feeding, housing, and organizing. These activities leave traces. The archaeological silence is real. It is one of the 2 primary pieces of evidence in this debate, alongside Schoch's geological argument. Any satisfying resolution of the debate has to account for both. The geological evidence points toward an older Sphinx. The archaeological silence points toward a younger one. The specific intellectual challenge is to explain why one of these lines of evidence should be weighted more heavily than the other. Schoch himself has proposed various ways to resolve this tension. including the possibility that the Sphinx was built by a culture of the African Humid Period that was less settled and less materially rich than the later pre-dynastic Egyptians. A culture of pastoralists or semi-nomadic herders who were capable of organized labor but who left fewer permanent traces than agriculturally settled peoples. The rock art of the Sahara demonstrates that the people of the humid period were capable of organized, sustained artistic effort. The Tassili paintings required scaffolding, planning, and collective labor on a significant scale. Whether rock art painters could also carve a 73-meter lion from bedrock is a different question. But the point is that the absence of evidence for a complex settled society does not necessarily mean the absence of all organized human activity. The paleoclimatological context enriches this possibility. The African Humid Period was a time of genuine abundance in what is now desert, a time when the resources existed to support larger and more complex human communities than the post-humid archaeology suggests. The rock art record of the Humid Period Sahara is not the record of a simple, struggling people. It is the record of a people who had the time and the resources to develop a rich artistic tradition, who lived with cattle and hippopotami and crocodiles, who painted elaborate hunting and herding scenes across thousands of rock surfaces. These people were capable of things we have not fully credited them with. Whether they were capable of the Sphinx is still an open question. But the African Humid Period establishes that the conditions for more complex human activity than the conventional timeline credits existed in northern Africa during exactly the period Schoch proposes for the Sphinx's construction. The climate and the archaeology point in different directions. The climate supports Schoch. The archaeology resists him. Both are real evidence. Both deserve weight. And the specific task of reconciling them is one of the most intellectually demanding problems in the study of the ancient world. Let me try to make the African Humid Period feel more real, because it is one of those facts about the deep past that is easy to state and difficult to truly absorb. The Sahara was green, not just slightly less arid, genuinely, extensively, abundantly green. The same landscape that is today among the most lifeless on the planet was, 10,000 years ago, a place of rivers and lakes and grasslands and animals. The cave paintings of Tassili Naja in Algeria, some of the most extraordinary rock art in the world, show this world in vivid detail. Painted cattle herds, swimming figures in scenes that can only represent rivers or lakes, elephants and giraffes and ostriches, the round-headed human figures of the earliest period who appear to be dancing or engaged in ritual activity. Later, the cattle herders with their distinctive elongated figures and their enormous herds. Later still, the horse-drawn chariots of a people who were already beginning to adapt to drier conditions. The entire sequence spans the African Humid Period and its end. The earliest paintings, the most abundant, the most elaborate, correspond to the wettest phase. The later paintings show fewer animals, fewer water scenes, and eventually the adaptation to a world that is becoming drier. The archaeology of the Saharan rock art is a record of a civilization adjusting in real time to the end of the conditions that had sustained it. These were not simple people. The elaborate, round-headed figures of the Tassili paintings required significant artistic sophistication, multiple pigments, knowledge of how to apply them to rock, and enough leisure time to develop and maintain a complex, artistic tradition. The cattle herders who followed were organized enough to manage large herds across the Saharan landscape, which required knowledge of seasonal water sources, migratory routes, and the social organization to coordinate group movement. If these people could do these things, if the humans of the African Humid Period were capable of the organizational and technological achievements the rock art implies, then the possibility of a sophisticated quarrying operation at Giza during the same period is not inherently implausible. It is unexpected. It has no archaeological support beyond the weathering argument. But it is not physically impossible given what we know about the capabilities of humid period North Africans. The African Humid Period was a real time. Real people lived in it. The Giza Plateau was in it. The rain fell on the limestone. The question is whether anyone was there to carve it. Let me give the Orthodox response its full weight. It would be easy in a discussion of this kind to treat the mainstream Egyptological position as a reflexive defense of established ideas against uncomfortable evidence. That is the narrative that surrounds the water erosion debate in popular accounts. The open-minded geologist challenging the entrenched establishment, the establishment closing ranks to protect its turf. That narrative is not entirely wrong. There is genuine territorial defensiveness in some of the Egyptological response to Schoch. But the Orthodox position also contains substantive arguments that deserve careful consideration. Arguments that go beyond mere assertion of the conventional date and engage with the specific evidence. Let me present those arguments honestly. The first and most important counter-argument is the one we have already discussed, the absence of archaeological evidence. But let me give it more depth than I have so far, because its force is greater than a simple statement of absence conveys. The argument is not merely that no evidence of a pre-dynastic complex society has been found at Giza. It is that the accumulated evidence of Egyptian archaeology over 2 centuries tells a coherent story of gradual development. A story in which the appearance of the Old Kingdom pyramid builders is not mysterious but explicable, as the culmination of a long process of social and technological development that can be traced in the archaeological record. That developmental sequence is well documented. The Badarian culture of Upper Egypt, from approximately 5000 to 4000 BCE, shows early agricultural settlement with simple pottery and small-scale social organization. The Naqada cultures that follow, from approximately 4000 to 3100 BCE, show increasing social stratification, expanding trade networks, and developing craft specialization. By the time of the First Dynasty, around 3100 BCE, the essential elements of Egyptian civilization, writing, monumental architecture, centralized state administration, are in place. This developmental sequence is important for 2 reasons. First, it explains why the Old Kingdom pyramid builders were capable of what they achieved. They were the culmination of 1,000 years of accelerating development, not an isolated phenomenon. Second, it provides no room for an earlier, more advanced society that then regressed or disappeared without trace. The Naqada sequence is continuous and coherent. There is no gap in it into which a Sphinx-building civilization could fit. If a sophisticated society existed at Giza in 7000 BCE, it was not the ancestor of the Naqada cultures. The Naqada sequence shows no discontinuity, no sudden appearance of borrowed techniques or ideas from an earlier and more capable tradition. The Sphinx-building culture would have to have been entirely separate from the developmental line that produced the historical Egyptians, leaving no trace in the genetic or cultural record of the people who eventually dominated the Nile Valley. This is not impossible, but it requires a specific model. A sophisticated early society that existed, produced one extraordinary monument, and then vanished completely, with no descendants and no lasting influence on the cultures that followed. That is difficult to reconcile with what we know about how human societies develop and interact. The second major counter-argument concerns the salt weathering hypothesis, which I introduced in the previous part, and which deserves a more thorough treatment. The advocates of salt weathering as the primary explanation for the Sphinx's unusual erosion patterns include Lal Ghauri, a geologist who has published specifically on the weathering mechanisms at Giza. Ghauri's argument is that the porous limestone of the Sphinx body and the enclosure walls has been subject to capillary rise of salt-laden groundwater over the 4,000 years since the monument was built. As the water rises through the porous rock and evaporates at the surface, it deposits salts, primarily gypsum and halite, within the pore spaces of the limestone. The crystallization of these salts exerts mechanical stress on the rock from within. The salt crystals grow and expand as more salt is deposited, eventually breaking apart the rock matrix and producing the characteristic flaking and pitting of salt weathering. Over 4,000 years of repeated cycles of wetting and drying, the salt-laden water rising and evaporating, this process can produce significant erosion. Ghauri argues that this process is sufficient to explain the depth and character of the weathering on the Sphinx, without requiring rainfall that Egypt has not experienced for thousands of years. Schoch's response, as we have noted, is that the morphology of salt weathering is different from what is observed on the Sphinx, that salt weathering produces granular disintegration and surface flaking rather than the deep, smooth, channel-like undulations that characterize the enclosure walls. He also argues that the spatial distribution of the weathering, deeper on the walls and body than on the upper surfaces, and concentrated in ways that reflect vertical water flow rather than capillary rise, is more consistent with rainfall than with salt weathering. The technical disagreement between Schoch and Ghauri has never been fully resolved, in part because neither has published the detailed petrographic analysis, the microscopic examination of the rock's texture and composition, that would allow independent evaluation of their competing claims. Both arguments are plausible in outline. Both have specific vulnerabilities. The resolution would require the kind of detailed, comparative, multi-technique analysis of the weathered surfaces that has not yet been undertaken. A third line of counter-argument concerns the assumption that the Old Kingdom tombs at Giza provide a valid comparison for the Sphinx. Schoch argues that the tombs show wind erosion, while the Sphinx shows water erosion, and that this difference implies the Sphinx is older. Critics argue that the comparison is not valid because the tombs are cut in different limestone layers from the Sphinx body, harder, less porous layers that would respond differently to any given weathering process. This is a substantive point. The Giza Plateau is geologically heterogeneous, and the weathering of limestone depends significantly on the specific properties of the rock: its porosity, its calcium carbonate content, its grain size, its fracture density. A softer, more porous limestone will weather faster under any given conditions than a harder, less porous limestone. Comparing the weathering of the Sphinx body, carved in the softest layers of the plateau, to the weathering of tombs cut in harder layers may not be a valid comparison even if they were the same age. Schoch is aware of this objection and has addressed it by pointing to the enclosure walls, which are cut in the harder limestone of the plateau and still show the water weathering pattern. The tombs, cut in the same hard limestone, show wind weathering. The enclosure walls show water weathering. The difference in weathering pattern between the enclosure walls and nearby tombs cannot be attributed to differences in limestone quality, because the limestone is the same. This is a strong rebuttal, and it is not clear that the Orthodox response has fully addressed it. The fourth counter-argument is more fundamental and more difficult to rebut: the argument from consistency. The conventional chronology of ancient Egypt is not based on the dating of the Sphinx alone. It is based on the convergent testimony of thousands of inscriptions, thousands of artifacts, and hundreds of stratigraphic sequences that together tell a coherent story about when things happened in ancient Egypt. The Sphinx fits into this story in a way that is consistent with its conventional dating. The Khafre attribution, the architectural associations, the stylistic parallels with 4th Dynasty art, the geological context of the Giza Plateau, all of these point to the Old Kingdom. Revising the Sphinx's date would not be a simple correction to a single fact. It would require revising the interpretation of a large number of converging lines of evidence, each of which independently supports the conventional dating. This is the argument from Consilience, the idea that when many independent lines of evidence converge on the same conclusion, that convergence is itself strong evidence for the conclusion's correctness. The conventional dating of the Sphinx is supported by Consilience. The water erosion hypothesis, which challenges it, is supported by one line of evidence, the specific weathering morphology. One line of evidence, however compelling, faces a high burden of proof when it contradicts a consensus supported by Consilience. This does not mean the one line of evidence is wrong. It means that the standard of proof required to overturn the consensus is higher than the standard required to establish a new finding in an open field. Schoch's argument is serious. His evidence is real. But the orthodox position is not simply ignorance or defensiveness. It is the accumulated weight of a coherent evidentiary framework that takes significant effort to dislodge. The debate continues, and both sides have genuine points to make. Let me spend more time with the figure of Zahi Hawass, because his role in the Sphinx debate is both significant and somewhat misrepresented in popular accounts. Hawass served as Secretary General of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities from 2002 to 2011, the most powerful position in Egyptian archaeology, and in various other official capacities before and since. He is a genuine scholar with real expertise in Old Kingdom archaeology, and his objections to Schoch's hypothesis are not merely political or territorial. They are rooted in a deep knowledge of the archaeological record of the Giza Plateau and of Old Kingdom Egypt more broadly. Hawass's primary objection, the one he has made consistently across 30 years of debate, is that the archaeological evidence for the Old Kingdom construction of the Sphinx is overwhelming and coherent, and that the specific sites and artifacts associated with the Sphinx fit seamlessly into the 4th Dynasty context that the conventional dating assigns them to. The workers' village at Giza, which Hawass's own excavations help to document in detail, provides direct evidence of the labor force that built the Giza monuments. The village shows the organization, the diet, the material culture, and the burial practices of the workers who built the pyramids. It is entirely consistent with a 4th Dynasty date and shows no evidence of activity from any earlier period. The workers' village is one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for the conventional dating of the Giza monuments. It demonstrates that the pyramid builders were real historical people who lived, worked, ate, and died at the site. Their remains are in the cemetery adjacent to the village. Their bones show the specific patterns of injury and physical stress consistent with heavy quarrying and construction work. They were not slaves. The evidence suggests they were paid workers, possibly conscripted for a portion of each year. And they were cared for when injured, given medical treatment, and buried respectfully when they died. This is the human reality behind the Giza monuments. Real people living in a real village doing real work, and doing it in the 4th Dynasty, not in 7000 BCE. Hawass argues that this evidence cannot be reconciled with Schoch's hypothesis unless you propose that the original Sphinx was carved by an entirely different people, in an earlier period, and that the 4th dynasty Egyptians then inherited or discovered this ancient monument and incorporated it into their pyramid complex. This is a more complicated hypothesis, and one for which there is no direct evidence. The complexity of this hypothesis is not a refutation of Schoch's geological argument. Geological evidence and archaeological evidence are different things, and one does not automatically trump the other. But it does illustrate why the mainstream response to Schoch is not simply obstinacy. The mainstream position is embedded in a detailed, humanized picture of Old Kingdom Egypt that would need to be significantly reorganized to accommodate an ancient sphinx. Let me also engage with the argument from Consilience more deeply, because I think it deserves more than I gave it earlier. The Consilience argument is genuinely powerful in this case. The conventional dating of the Sphinx is not based on a single artifact or a single inscription. It is based on the spatial and temporal context of the monument within the Giza complex, on the architectural parallels with securely dated Old Kingdom structures, on the iconographic parallels between the face of the Sphinx and known representations of Khafre, on the workers' village evidence, and on the general coherence of the Old Kingdom archaeological record at Giza. Each of these lines of evidence is imperfect on its own. The face of the Sphinx has been recarved. The architectural parallels are circumstantial. The workers' village evidence relates to the pyramids rather than specifically to the Sphinx. But when multiple imperfect lines of evidence converge on the same conclusion, the convergence is itself meaningful. It is unlikely that all of them would independently point to the same period if that period were wrong. Schoch's geological argument is a single strong line of evidence that contradicts this consilience. The question is whether a single strong line of evidence can overturn a convergent consensus. And the history of science suggests that sometimes it can, and sometimes it cannot. It can when the single line of evidence is genuinely decisive, when it is physically impossible for the conventional explanation to be correct. Think of the discovery of ancient microorganisms in rock strata that predate the conventional origin of life. The fossil evidence was decisive enough to overturn the consensus, not because it was one line against many, but because the evidence was physically incompatible with the conventional model. Schoch's evidence is strong, but not quite decisive in that way. The geological argument makes the conventional dating improbable. It is hard to explain the weathering without a much older date, but it does not make it physically impossible. The salt weathering hypothesis, however inadequate Schoch believes it to be, is at least physically possible as an alternative explanation. It has not been conclusively ruled out. The debate therefore sits in an uncomfortable epistemic space. Strong geological evidence for an older date, multiple converging lines of circumstantial evidence for a younger date, and no single piece of evidence that forces a definitive conclusion. This is the space that the Sphinx debate has occupied for 30 years. And it is a space that can only be resolved by more evidence, more analysis, and the specific kind of intellectual honesty that sets aside the wish for a particular conclusion and follows the data wherever it leads. Let me think about what it would actually mean if Schoch is right. Not in the popular culture sense of what it would mean for conspiracy theories or lost civilization narratives. In the specific, concrete sense of what it would mean for our understanding of prehistoric human society in the Nile Valley. What it would require us to believe, what it would imply about the people who built the Sphinx, and how it would fit into or challenge the broader picture of human prehistory that we have assembled from decades of archaeology and paleoclimatology. If the Sphinx was built before approximately 5000 BCE, before the end of the African Humid Period, then the people who built it were living in an Egypt that was very different from the Egypt of the pharaohs. The Giza Plateau was not desert. It received regular rainfall. The vegetation around it was grassland or savanna rather than sand. The Nile Valley was wetter, broader, more productive than it is today. The people living there during the African Humid Period were, as we discussed in the previous part, already capable of organized activity on a significant scale. The Tassili rock art demonstrates artistic sophistication and social organization. The cattle herding traditions of the humid period Sahara demonstrate economic complexity and the ability to coordinate movement across large landscapes. But carving the Sphinx requires something beyond what the rock art and the herding traditions demonstrate. It requires the specific capability of organized stone quarrying, the ability to identify a suitable rock outcrop, to plan the quarrying operation, to organize the workforce needed to execute it, to supply that workforce with food and water during the operation, and to apply the specific technical knowledge of how to cut and shape limestone. These capabilities are not simple. They are the capabilities of a complex, hierarchically organized society with enough surplus production to free a substantial portion of its workforce from food production for the duration of the quarrying project. In short, they are the capabilities of a state, or something functionally like a state, even if not a state of the complexity and elaboration of the Old Kingdom. The question is whether a society with these capabilities existed in the Nile Valley at the proposed dates. The conventional answer is no. The archaeological record shows nothing of the kind, but the absence of evidence argument cuts in both directions. The Nile Valley during the African Humid Period has not been as intensively searched for the traces of a pre-Naqada complex society as it has been searched for the traces of later periods. The specific kinds of sites that a hunter-gatherer plus society or a mobile pastoralist society would leave are different from the kinds of sites that sedentary agricultural societies leave. And the search methods used in Egyptian archaeology have been calibrated primarily to find the latter. There is also a specific geographic consideration. The Giza Plateau sits at the western edge of the Nile Valley, at the margin between the valley floor and the desert plateau. During the African Humid Period, the desert plateau was not desert. It was receiving rainfall and supporting vegetation. If the builders of an early Sphinx were not Nile Valley agriculturalists, but plateau pastoralists who used the resources of the wetter plateau, their campsites and their settlement traces would be in places that have been less thoroughly searched than the Nile Valley floor. This is speculative. I want to be clear that I am describing possibilities, not established facts. But the specific geography of the Giza area during the humid period means that the argument from archaeological silence is slightly less powerful than it would be for a site in the center of the Nile Valley, where the search for pre-dynastic material has been most intensive. Now let me think about the specific scale of the Sphinx in relation to what we know about the social organization of the African Humid Period. The Sphinx is a large monument, but it is not as large or as technically demanding as the Great Pyramid. The Great Pyramid required the quarrying, transport, and precise placement of approximately 2.3 million stone blocks averaging 2.5 tons each. An engineering challenge that required sophisticated logistical organization, precise surveying, and sustained labor over decades. The Sphinx, by contrast, was carved in place from a single rock outcrop. It did not require the transport of blocks. It required only the removal of material from around and above the original knoll. A process that, while physically demanding, is significantly simpler in its logistical requirements than pyramid construction. The quarrying of the Sphinx enclosure produced the core blocks of the Sphinx Temple and the Valley Temple. Large blocks, certainly, but blocks that were moved only a short distance from the quarry to their final position. The labor required to move them was substantial, but not qualitatively different from the labor required for other large-scale stone working operations that we know were conducted in the ancient world. The specific organizational requirements of building the Sphinx, in the sense of the original carving, not the subsequent temple construction, are therefore more modest than they might appear. A society capable of sustained collective labor, with enough surplus to feed a workforce for the duration of the project, could in principle have done it. The workforce required for the Sphinx alone was probably smaller than the workforce that built Göbekli Tepe. And Göbekli Tepe was built by a hunter-gatherer society that, by the conventional model, should not have been able to produce a monumental construction. The Göbekli Tepe parallel deserves extended treatment here because it is the single most important piece of evidence that the conventional model of prehistoric human capability is wrong in the specific ways that Schoch's hypothesis requires. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey is a complex of carved stone pillars dating to approximately 10,000 to 8,000 BCE. The pillars are large, some more than 5 meters tall and weighing many tons, and they are carved with elaborate reliefs of animals and abstract symbols. The site has multiple layers of construction, with the earlier layers being more elaborate than the later ones, a reversal of the usual pattern of increasing sophistication over time that is one of the site's most puzzling features. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers. There is no evidence of agriculture or permanent settlement at the site. They had no domesticated animals except possibly dogs. By the standard model of social evolution, they should not have been capable of the organized, sustained, technically sophisticated construction that the site represents. And yet, the site exists. The pillars are there. The carvings are there. The evidence is unambiguous. What Göbekli Tepe demonstrates is that the capabilities of prehistoric human societies have been systematically underestimated by the conventional model. That organized, technically sophisticated collective action is possible before the development of agriculture and the centralized state, given sufficient motivation and sufficient time. This does not prove that the Sphinx is ancient. It does not provide a direct parallel for a quarrying operation in Egypt, but it establishes the general principle that extraordinary monumental construction is not necessarily a sign of a fully developed state-level society. It can be a product of a simpler but sufficiently motivated and organized community. If hunter-gatherers in Turkey could build Göbekli Tepe at 10,000 BCE, the assertion that no one in the Nile Valley could have carved the Sphinx at the same period is considerably less compelling than it was before Göbekli Tepe was excavated. The world that Schoch's hypothesis requires is not impossible. It is a world in which the African Humid Period supported a more complex and more capable human society in the Nile Valley and surrounding region than the conventional model credits. A society that left the Sphinx as its most enduring monument, and that was eventually absorbed, displaced, or transformed as the climate changed and the Nile Valley became the center of what we call Egyptian civilization. This is a possible world, it is not a proven world, but the distance between possible and proven is exactly where all the most interesting historical questions live. And the Sphinx, standing in the dark at Giza with its ancient weathered limestone, is one of the most eloquent markers of that distance. Let me think more carefully about the specific model of human prehistory that the water erosion hypothesis implies, because I think it is worth being precise about what kind of claim is actually being made. Schoch is not claiming that an advanced technological civilization existed in Egypt in 7000 BCE, not in the sense of a civilization with writing, complex mathematics, metalworking, or the other specific capabilities we associate with the Old Kingdom. His claim is more modest, that a society capable of organized stone quarrying existed in the Nile Valley or on the Giza Plateau at dates earlier than the conventional model credits. This distinction matters enormously because the dramatic versions of the ancient civilization hypothesis, the Atlantis narratives, the claims about lost continents with advanced technology, require something much more extraordinary than what Schoch's geological evidence actually supports. Schoch's evidence supports an older sphinx. It does not support a technologically advanced pre-dynastic empire. The specific capability required to carve the original sphinx body, not the temples, not the later additions, just the body, is the capability to organize a quarrying workforce, to plan the carving of a specific shape from a specific rock outcrop, and to sustain the effort over the time required to complete it. This is impressive. It is beyond what the conventional model credits to the people of 7000 BCE Egypt. But it is not the same as claiming that those people had electricity or computers or interstellar travel. The Göbekli Tepe analogy is directly relevant here. What Göbekli Tepe demonstrates is that organized collective action producing substantial stone monuments is possible for hunter-gatherer societies under specific conditions. The specific conditions appear to involve sufficient resource abundance, enough food to free some of the population from constant foraging, and sufficient social organization to coordinate collective labor across what may have been multiple communities. The African Humid Period created exactly these conditions in what is now the Sahara and the Nile region. Resource abundance during the Humid Period supported denser and more complex human communities than the post-Humid Period supported. The people of the Humid Period Nile Valley were not starving nomads scraping for survival. They were living in a relatively productive landscape that could support organized collective activity. There is also a specific and often overlooked point about the relationship between the Sphinx's location and the resources available during the African Humid Period. The Giza Plateau overlooks the Nile Valley. It is elevated above the floodplain and provides a commanding view of the surrounding landscape. In the Humid Period, when the plateau was receiving rainfall, and the Nile Valley was a productive agricultural and pastoral landscape, the specific location of the Sphinx would have had a different quality than it has today. A prominent rock outcrop on a high plateau, overlooking a productive valley, visible from a great distance. This is exactly the kind of location that attracts human attention and human meaning-making. Rock formations with unusual shapes have been the sites of human activity, art, ritual, monument building, across the world and across all periods of prehistory. The specific knoll from which the Sphinx was carved may have been a significant landmark and a focus of human attention long before anyone decided to carve it. If a society in the Humid Period Nile Valley regarded the Giza Plateau as significant, as a sacred place, a ceremonial center, a landmark in a meaningful landscape, the decision to carve a monument there would be intelligible without requiring that society to be a fully developed state. This is the model that makes Schoch's hypothesis most coherent. Not an advanced lost civilization, not a state-level society comparable to the Old Kingdom, but a complex, organized, culturally rich community of the African Humid Period, living in a world of grass and rivers and cattle, which chose to carve a specific shape from a specific rock on a specific plateau that was meaningful to them. Who the Sphinx was to them, what the lion body and the human head represented in their cosmology or their social organization, we cannot know. The monument's meaning is as inaccessible as its age is uncertain. But the monument's existence, if Schoch is right, is a testament to something real about the people who made it. A testament to the fact that the human impulse to shape stone into meaning is older than we thought, perhaps much older. Let me also think about what it would mean for Egyptian history if the Sphinx predates the Old Kingdom. Not for the lost civilization narrative, but for the specific story we tell about how Egyptian civilization developed. The conventional story of ancient Egypt is one of gradual development, from the simple pre-dynastic villages of the 4th millennium BCE to the extraordinary achievements of the Old Kingdom, driven by the specific conditions of the Nile Valley. The predictable annual flood that deposited fresh, fertile soil, the navigable river that allowed trade and communication across thousands of kilometers, the natural boundaries of desert that provided protection from invasion. In this story, the greatness of ancient Egypt was produced by the Nile, the specific geography of the Nile Valley selected for the specific capabilities: hydraulic management, long-distance trade, centralized administration that eventually produced the pyramid builders. An ancient sphinx does not necessarily contradict this story. It could be incorporated into a modified version of it in which an early phase of significant human activity on the Giza Plateau predates the pre-dynastic period, a phase that left the Sphinx but little else, and that was eventually absorbed into or replaced by the developing pre-dynastic cultures of the Nile Valley. The Old Kingdom Egyptians may have been aware of this earlier phase. The way they treated the Sphinx, clearing it of sand, recarving its head, building temples in front of it, suggests that they regarded it as ancient even by their standards. The Dream Stele's account of the Sphinx speaking to Thutmose IV and claiming an antiquity that the New Kingdom Egyptians themselves found remarkable may reflect a genuine tradition that the Sphinx was very old, older than dynastic Egypt, older than the memory of the Egyptian state. The ancient Egyptians may have known something about the Sphinx that we have forgotten, and the geological evidence may be the first modern tool capable of recovering what they knew. Let me place the Sphinx water erosion debate in a broader context. The specific question of when the Sphinx was built is important in its own right, but it is also part of a larger question that has been developing across archaeological and geological research over the last 3 decades. A question about whether the conventional timeline of human civilization, with its assumption that complexity began with agriculture and the first cities in Mesopotamia around 5000 BCE, is actually correct. The evidence that has accumulated since the 1990s suggests that the conventional timeline may underestimate human capability in the period before agriculture. Göbekli Tepe is the most dramatic example, but it is not the only one. A picture is slowly emerging of a prehistoric world that was more complex, more connected, and more capable than the old model assumed. Let me develop the Göbekli Tepe case more fully, because it is the clearest and best documented example of what that picture looks like. Göbekli Tepe was excavated beginning in 1994 by the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who worked at the site until his death in 2014. What he found over those 2 decades transformed the field. The site consists of multiple circles of large T-shaped limestone pillars, each circle enclosing a space of roughly 20 to 30 meters in diameter. The pillars are carved with reliefs of animals: foxes, scorpions, vultures, aurochs, snakes, ducks, and with abstract symbols whose meaning remains unknown. Some of the largest pillars are more than 5 meters tall and weigh more than 10 tons. The site has been reliably dated by multiple independent methods to between approximately 10,000 and 8,000 BCE. This is before agriculture, before pottery, before the domestication of any animals except possibly dogs. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were, by the standard definitions, still living in the Upper Paleolithic or Early Mesolithic period, the period that the old model assigned to simple bands of hunter-gatherers with no capacity for organized collective action beyond the scale of a single family group. And yet, they built Göbekli Tepe. The specific scale of the operation at Göbekli Tepe is worth dwelling on. The pillars are made of limestone quarried from the bedrock of the hilltop on which the site stands. The quarrying required tools and technique. The pillars had to be shaped. The T-form is regular and deliberate, not a natural rock formation. The carvings on the pillars required sustained artistic effort. The circles had to be planned and laid out. And eventually, this is one of the most remarkable features of the site, each circle was deliberately buried, filled in with rubble, and a new circle constructed on top of it. This deliberate burial and rebuilding continued for centuries. The specific act of burying the completed circles is one of the most puzzling aspects of Göbekli Tepe. It is not the behavior of a practical society building useful structures. It is the behavior of a society engaged in a sustained ritual program. A society for which the act of building and then burying these structures had a meaning that required continuation across generations. This tells us something important about the people of Göbekli Tepe. They were not just capable of organized labor. They had a sufficiently developed symbolic and ritual life to motivate sustained collective effort across decades or centuries. They had leaders or priests or some kind of authority structure capable of maintaining the program across generations. They had a relationship to the past, to the buried circles beneath their feet, that shaped their behavior in the present. These are the characteristics of a complex society in every meaningful sense except the material one. They are not the characteristics of simple, opportunistic foragers. They are the characteristics of people with a rich inner life and a sophisticated relationship to time, to the sacred, and to collective identity. The implications for the Sphinx debate are real but indirect. Göbekli Tepe does not prove that the Sphinx is ancient. It does not establish that a similarly capable society existed in the Nile Valley at the same period. But it establishes the general principle that our model of what hunter-gatherer or pre-agricultural societies were capable of was wrong. It establishes that the specific combination of ritual motivation, organized labor, and technical skill that monumental construction requires was present in prehistoric human societies before the agricultural revolution. Given that Göbekli Tepe existed, the prior probability of a similarly motivated and organized society producing the original Sphinx in the Nile Valley during the African Humid Period is higher than it was before Göbekli Tepe was excavated. Not proven, not certain, but higher. Now let me turn to the broader pattern of pre-dynastic and early dynastic evidence from Egypt itself, because there is relevant material here that does not directly address the Sphinx, but that enriches the context. The pre-dynastic period in Egypt, from approximately 5000 to 3100 BCE, is better understood now than it was when Schoch first made his argument in 1992. Decades of additional excavation, combined with improved dating techniques and better understanding of the Saharan archaeology, have filled in the picture of the period immediately before the dynastic state. What the improved picture shows is a world in transition. The African Humid Period was ending. The Sahara was drying. The populations that had been dispersed across the Saharan grasslands during the humid period were concentrating in the Nile Valley as the surrounding landscape became inhospitable. The Nile Valley, with its reliable annual flood and its narrow but extraordinarily productive floodplain, became the refuge and the crucible of what would become Egyptian civilization. This population concentration is documented in the archaeological record. The pre-dynastic sites of Upper Egypt show increasing population density and increasing social complexity from roughly 4500 BCE onward, the specific period when the drying of the Sahara was accelerating. The people moving into the Nile Valley from the drying Sahara brought with them the cultural traditions, the artistic styles, and possibly the astronomical knowledge that they had developed during the humid period. This is the specific mechanism that could connect a humid period sphinx to the historical Egypt that eventually incorporated it into its sacred landscape. The people who built the Sphinx, if they existed, if Schoch is right, were not entirely separate from the people who became the ancient Egyptians. They were their ancestors, or at least their cultural antecedents, the people whose descendant communities eventually concentrated in the Nile Valley and developed into the dynastic state. In this model, the Sphinx is not the monument of a lost civilization with no connection to historical Egypt. It is the monument of a proto-Egyptian culture, a culture of the African Humid Period whose descendants became the Egyptians. The Egyptians inherited the Sphinx along with many other aspects of their cultural heritage from the Humid Period Saharan world, and they recognized it as ancient and sacred, even if they could not fully account for its age. This is speculative, but it is speculative in a way that connects to real patterns in the archaeological and paleoclimatological record. The drying of the Sahara, the concentration of population in the Nile Valley, the cultural continuities between the Saharan rock art tradition and early Egyptian art. It is not speculation from nowhere. It is speculation from a specific evidential context. The broader context also includes other sites around the world that suggest a richer and more complex prehistoric human world than the standard model assumed. The underwater megalithic structures off the coast of Japan at Yonaguni, now submerged under 30 meters of water, date to a period when sea levels were lower, before the end of the last ice age. The stone circles of Malta, built before Stonehenge and before the pyramids, demonstrate a level of architectural sophistication in a small island population that challenges simple models of prehistoric capability. The astronomical alignments at sites across the world, Newgrange in Ireland, Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, Nabta Playa in Egypt itself, demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of celestial cycles that predates the conventionally credited origins of astronomy. Nabta Playa is particularly relevant here because it is an astronomical stone circle in the Egyptian Sahara, dated to approximately 5000 BCE, built by the cattle herders of the African Humid Period. It demonstrates that the people of the Humid Period Sahara were tracking the sun and the stars, and were capable of constructing monuments with astronomical alignments. These people were watching the sky. They were building monuments. They were doing it in the right part of the world at the right time. The question is whether they also carved a lion from the bedrock of the Giza Plateau. The evidence does not answer that question definitively, but it makes the question more interesting than it has sometimes been treated. Let me spend more time with the Nabta Playa site specifically, because it is Egyptian, it is dated to the right period, and it is not well known enough to have had the full weight of its implications absorbed by the mainstream. Nabta Playa is a dry lake bed in the western desert of Egypt, approximately 100 kilometers west of Abu Simbel and about 800 kilometers south of Giza. During the African Humid Period, it was a seasonal lake, filling with rainwater each summer and providing a reliable water source for the cattle herders who used the region. Archaeological excavations at the site, conducted from the 1970s onward by a team led by Fred Wendorf of Southern Methodist University, revealed a series of remarkable structures. The most dramatic of these is a stone circle approximately 4 meters in diameter, with pairs of aligned stones that appear to mark the direction of the summer solstice sunrise. The circle has been dated to approximately 5000 to 6000 BCE, the late African Humid Period, when the Sahara was beginning to dry and the cattle herders who used Nabta Playa were preparing to leave. Wendorf and his colleague Kim Malville, an astronomer, argued that the alignments were deliberate astronomical markers, that the people who built them were tracking the sun across the year and using the solstice alignment as part of a seasonal calendar. Beyond the stone circle, Nabta Playa contains a series of large buried stone structures, megalithic sculptures essentially, that were placed underground in deliberate arrangements that suggest ceremonial significance. Some of these structures weigh several tons. They were transported to the site, shaped and buried. Exactly the kind of behavior we see at Göbekli Tepe. The same combination of organized collective labor with ritual purpose. What Nabta Playa establishes is that the cattle herders of the African Humid Period in the Egyptian Western Desert were building astronomically aligned monuments and engaging in ritual practices involving the deliberate placement and burial of large stones. They were doing this in Egypt during the Humid Period, at dates that overlap with or predate the earlier end of Schoch's proposed range for the Sphinx. The people who built Nabta Playa are the same general population as the people Schoch is proposing as the builders of the original Sphinx. Not the same individuals, not the same specific community. Nabta Playa is 800 kilometers from Giza, but the same cultural tradition, the cattle herders of the African Humid Period, tracking the stars, building stone monuments, conducting rituals, involving the deliberate shaping and placement of limestone. If these people could build what they built at Nabta Playa, the proposal that a related community could have carved the original Sphinx at Giza is not a leap. It is a small step, an extension of a demonstrated capability to a larger scale and a more northerly location. The conventional Egyptological response to Nabta Playa has been to treat it as an interesting but peripheral phenomenon, a regional tradition of the Western Desert that had no significant influence on the development of Nile Valley civilization. This response may be correct. The specific connections between the Nabta Playa tradition and the pre-dynastic culture of Upper Egypt are not fully established. But the response may also reflect the same kind of compartmentalization that has characterized the response to Schoch's argument. The tendency to treat inconvenient evidence as peripheral rather than engaging with what it implies. The emerging picture when you put Göbekli Tepe and Nabta Playa and the African Humid Period together is of a prehistoric world in which organized collective activity producing monumental structures was more widespread and more capable than the standard model assumed. A world in which the conventional narrative of complexity beginning with agriculture and cities in Mesopotamia is not wrong exactly, but is incomplete. The Sphinx sits in this emerging picture as a potential example of the same phenomenon. A monumental construction of the pre-agricultural or early agricultural world, built by people who were more capable than we gave them credit for, in a place that was more productive and more culturally active than the subsequent desert suggests. Whether the Sphinx is genuinely part of this pattern, or whether it is a Fourth Dynasty monument that happens to show unusual weathering, is the specific question that the water erosion debate has been trying to resolve for 30 years. The broader archaeological picture has made the first possibility more plausible over time. The specific geological evidence has remained contested, and the Sphinx itself has continued to sit at Giza, neither confirming nor denying, waiting for a resolution that has not yet arrived. Let me also think about what it means that new sites of this kind keep being found. That each decade of archaeology seems to push back the frontier of demonstrated human capability by another few centuries or another few kilometers. Göbekli Tepe was not known to the public before Klaus Schmidt began excavating it in 1994. For the entire history of modern archaeology before that date, the earliest known monumental construction was the megalithic tombs of Western Europe, dated to approximately 4,500 BCE. Within 20 years of excavation, Göbekli Tepe had pushed that date back to 10,000 BCE. by 5.5 millennia. The reason Göbekli Tepe was not found earlier is partly that it was in an unlikely location, a hilltop in southeastern Turkey that had not been a priority for excavation. Partly it is because the stone pillars had been deliberately buried, making their presence invisible without excavation. And partly it is because the conventional model provided no reason to expect anything there. The model predicted simple hunter-gatherer campsites for this period, not monumental circles of carved stone. The same logic applies to the Giza Plateau in the African Humid Period. The conventional model predicts nothing remarkable on the plateau before the pre-dynastic period. The excavation strategies at Giza have been designed to find Old Kingdom material, because that is what the model predicts. If the evidence for an earlier phase of activity at the site is subtle, if it consists of a recarved monument and some weathered enclosure walls rather than a buried city, it might not be found unless someone is specifically looking for it. Schoch has been looking for it since 1990. He has found the geological evidence he believes supports the case. What he has not found, what no one has found, is the complementary archaeological evidence that would make the case decisive. The absence of that archaeological evidence is the most serious challenge to his hypothesis. But it is not necessarily the last word. The archaeology of the African Humid Period Sahara is still being developed. Sites are still being found. The specific kinds of evidence that a pre-Naqada complex community would leave are not yet fully understood, and the search strategies that would most efficiently find them are not yet fully developed. The Sphinx debate may ultimately be resolved not by a more detailed analysis of the limestone weathering, but by an archaeological discovery. The finding of a site that demonstrates beyond reasonable doubt the existence of an organized monument-building community in or near the Nile Valley at the dates Schoch proposes. Such a discovery has not been made, but the history of Göbekli Tepe suggests it should not be considered impossible. Let me give you the honest accounting. After everything we have explored, the geology, the climate history, the archaeology, the Orthodox response, the broader prehistoric context, what can we actually say with confidence about the Sphinx and the water erosion debate? Let me start with what is genuinely established beyond serious scholarly dispute. The Great Sphinx of Giza is one of the oldest and largest monumental sculptures in the world. It is carved from the limestone bedrock of the Giza Plateau in a specific geological formation characterized by distinct layers of varying hardness and porosity. The limestone of the Sphinx body is softer and more porous than the limestone of the surrounding plateau and of the head. The monument faces due east. The vellum of the Voynich manuscript is dated. No, let me correct myself. The limestone of the Sphinx enclosure does show weathering. That weathering is real, measurable, and observable. No serious scholar disputes that the Sphinx has been significantly weathered. What is established is that the Sphinx exists and is ancient. What is disputed is how ancient. The conventional dating, approximately 2500 BCE, during the reign of Khafre, is supported by a substantial body of circumstantial and contextual evidence. The spatial association with Khafre's pyramid complex, the architectural parallels with 4th dynasty construction, the iconographic connections to Old Kingdom royal portraiture, the workers' village evidence for large-scale construction activity at Giza during the Old Kingdom, and the general coherence of the conventional chronology of Egyptian civilization. This dating is not proven by a direct inscription. There is no text carved on the Sphinx or on any structure definitively associated with it that says Khafre built this. The dating is inferred from association and context, not from direct documentary evidence. This is a real limitation of the conventional case. There though it is a limitation shared by many important datings in ancient history. Schoch's alternative dating, somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 BCE, with the body of the monument having been carved during or before the African Humid Period, is supported by a specific and substantive geological argument based on the morphology of the weathering on the Sphinx body and enclosure walls. This argument has been made in peer-reviewed publications by a credentialed geologist and has not been definitively refuted. The counter-arguments: salt weathering as an alternative explanation, the geological heterogeneity of the limestone, the argument from archaeological silence, are real and substantive, but not conclusive. The salt weathering hypothesis, in particular, has not been supported by the kind of detailed petrographic analysis that would be needed to confirm or reject it definitively. The debate remains open. What has changed since Schoch first made his argument in 1992? The paleoclimatological evidence for the African Humid Period has become significantly more detailed and more robust. The picture of when and how wet the eastern Sahara was during the humid period is now better characterized than it was 30 years ago. And it is broadly consistent with Schoch's claim that the Giza Plateau received significant rainfall during the period he proposes for the Sphinx's construction. The climate argument has gotten stronger, not weaker, over 30 years of additional research. The broader archaeological context has also shifted in Schoch's favor. The discovery and excavation of Göbekli Tepe has established that monumental construction by pre-agricultural societies is not only possible, but documented. The excavation of Nabta Playa has established that the cattle herders of the African Humid Period in the Egyptian Western Desert were building astronomically aligned stone monuments at dates that overlap with Schoch's proposed range for the Sphinx. The world that Schoch's hypothesis requires is somewhat more plausible in 2025 than it was in 1992. At the same time, the specific geological argument has not been significantly advanced beyond its original formulation. Schoch has refined and defended his position across 30 years, but the core argument remains the same. The weathering morphology is watertype. The watertype weathering requires rainfall conditions that ended before the conventional date of construction. Therefore, the Sphinx is older than conventionally dated. No major new geological evidence has been added to the case since the original seismic survey and the surface weathering analysis. The specific petrographic analysis that would most directly test the salt weathering alternative, detailed microscopic examination of the weathered surfaces to characterize their texture and composition, has not been published by any party to the debate. This is a significant gap in the evidentiary record. It is the specific analysis most likely to produce a clearer answer to the question of whether the weathering is primarily water-driven or salt-driven, and its absence after 30 years of debate is frustrating. Part of the reason for this gap is access. The Sphinx is not a rock outcrop in the open country where a geologist can take samples freely. It is one of the most famous and most protected monuments in the world, under the jurisdiction of the Egyptian government, and obtaining permission to take surface samples for petrographic analysis requires navigating a bureaucratic process that has not always been cooperative with researchers whose conclusions the Egyptian authorities find inconvenient. Schoch has reported difficulties in obtaining access for certain kinds of analysis. This is a real constraint on the ability of the geological argument to advance. Without samples, the petrographic analysis cannot be done. Without the petrographic analysis, the salt weathering versus rainfall weathering question cannot be resolved at the level of physical evidence. It is possible that the debate is being prolonged not by the intrinsic difficulty of the question, but by the practical difficulty of getting access to the physical evidence needed to answer it. Now let me try to say something about the relative merits of the two positions, attempting as much honesty as I can manage. The geological argument is serious. Schoch is a real geologist with real credentials in the relevant field, and his observation that the weathering morphology of the Sphinx enclosure walls is water-type rather than wind-type is based on genuine expertise. The counter-arguments to the geological case have not fully addressed his specific observations about the enclosure walls. The salt weathering alternative remains possible, but unproven. The conventional case is also serious. The contextual and archaeological evidence for an Old Kingdom date is substantial, and the absence of archaeological evidence for a pre-Naqada complex society in the Nile Valley is a real challenge to Schoch's hypothesis. The argument from Consilience that multiple independent lines of evidence converge on the conventional date is a genuine strength of the mainstream position. Neither side has the knockout evidence. Neither side has been able to produce the specific proof that would force the other to concede. The honest position is one of genuine uncertainty. The Sphinx may be older than we think. The geological evidence for this is real and has not been refuted. The implications of this possibility are significant for our understanding of human prehistory. The Sphinx may be exactly as old as the conventional dating suggests. The contextual and archaeological evidence for this is substantial and coherent. The salt weathering and geological heterogeneity counterarguments provide plausible alternative explanations for the weathering. Both possibilities are consistent with the evidence we have. The question is not resolved. The honest position acknowledges this, and the Sphinx, patient in the desert, offers no help. It was here before the debate began. It will be here long after it is resolved, or long after we have accepted that it will not be. Let me spend more time with the specific problem of access that I mentioned, because it is an under-discussed aspect of this debate that has real consequences for its resolution. Scientific debates are supposed to be resolved by evidence. The specific evidence that would most directly bear on the salt weathering versus rainfall weathering question is microscopic. The texture of the weathered surfaces at the grain level, the specific mineralogy of the weathered material, the pattern of alteration within the rock. These things can be characterized by petrographic analysis of rock samples taken from the weathered surfaces. But you cannot take rock samples from the Great Sphinx without the permission of the Egyptian authorities. The Sphinx is not just any rock. It is a World Heritage Site, a national symbol, and an object of intense national pride. The Egyptian government has historically been protective of its control over access to the Giza monuments, and researchers whose work might challenge the conventional dating of Egyptian civilization have sometimes found that access becomes more difficult after their conclusions become known. This is a real problem for science. When the resolution of a scientific question depends on physical evidence that is only accessible through a political process, the scientific question becomes entangled with the political process in ways that distort the normal course of scientific debate. Schoch has been more fortunate in terms of access than some researchers who have worked on the Sphinx. He has been able to return to the site multiple times and has conducted the seismic analysis and surface observations that form the basis of his argument. But the more invasive analysis, the drilling, the coring, the surface sampling that petrographic analysis requires, has not been available to him. The Egyptian authorities have also not facilitated independent verification of the geological evidence by other researchers. The specific claims about the weathering morphology could, in principle, be tested by any competent geologist who examined the enclosure walls with the specific questions in mind. But the access required to do this systematically and rigorously has not been freely available. This situation is not unique to the Sphinx debate. Many of the most important questions in archaeology and ancient history are entangled with national politics and access restrictions in similar ways. The Dead Sea Scrolls were controlled for decades by a small group of scholars who restricted access and thereby delayed the broader scholarly engagement that would have accelerated their analysis. The terracotta army in China is still being excavated very slowly because the Chinese government is cautious about the conditions under which excavation proceeds. These access restrictions are sometimes justified. Poorly conducted excavation destroys evidence. Reckless sampling damages irreplaceable objects. The protection of major archaeological sites from inadequate or politically motivated research is a legitimate concern. But the effect is that some of the most important questions in ancient history remain unresolved longer than they need to, because the specific evidence needed to resolve them is inaccessible, and the political conditions for accessing it are difficult. The Sphinx water erosion debate is a clear example. 30 years is a long time for a scientific question to remain unresolved when the evidence needed to answer it is, in principle, physically present and accessible. The specific technical question is the weathering water type or salt type, and how does the depth of weathering compare with known weathering rates, is not intrinsically difficult. It requires geological expertise and physical access. The expertise is available. The access has been limited. If the Egyptian authorities were to facilitate a comprehensive, multi-technique geological analysis of the Sphinx enclosure walls, petrographic analysis of surface samples, detailed mapping of the weathering patterns, comparison with nearby securely dated structures, replication of Schoch's seismic survey with more sophisticated equipment. The debate could, in principle, be substantially advanced within a few years. Whether that analysis would confirm Schoch's interpretation or refute it is genuinely unknown. But it would at least move the question toward resolution, rather than leaving it suspended in the ambiguous middle ground where it has been for 3 decades. The Sphinx deserves that analysis. The debate deserves that resolution. And the limestone, patient and weathered, is waiting to be read. Let me also think about the broader epistemological lesson of the Sphinx debate. The lesson about how scientific disputes in historical sciences work and why they are often harder to resolve than disputes in experimental sciences. In an experimental science, physics, chemistry, molecular biology, a disputed question can often be resolved by designing a specific experiment that produces a decisive result. You can test the hypothesis directly in controlled conditions with reproducible results. If the experiment is well designed and the results are clear, the question is answered. Historical sciences, geology, archaeology, paleoclimatology, cannot work this way. The objects of study are specific, unrepeatable, and often inaccessible. You cannot run the Sphinx through a second experiment to test a different hypothesis. You cannot reproduce the climate of the African Humid Period in a laboratory to measure limestone weathering rates under those specific conditions. You work with what the past has left you, using the best methods available, and you try to extract the most information you can from evidence that is always incomplete. The specific difficulty of the Sphinx debate is that the most relevant physical evidence, the microscopic texture of the weathered surfaces, is present in the material but has not been systematically accessed. The debate has been conducted primarily at the level of observation and argument, rather than at the level of the detailed material analysis that would most directly test the competing hypotheses. This is not unusual for historical science disputes. The resolution of many major questions in geology, archaeology, and paleoclimatology has had to wait for technological advances that made previously inaccessible evidence accessible. The resolution of the Sphinx debate may require a similar advance. either in the technology for analyzing weathered surfaces non-destructively, or in the political conditions that determine access to the physical evidence. Both advances are conceivable. Non-destructive surface analysis techniques have improved significantly in the last 2 decades, and methods that were not available to Schoch in 1992 are now available. And political conditions change. The Egyptian government's approach to access may evolve as the broader scholarly understanding of the African Humid Period and its implications becomes more widely appreciated. The question may still be answered. It has not been answered yet. And that honest acknowledgement that we do not know, that the question is real and the evidence is genuinely contested, is the most important thing to carry from tonight's exploration of this remarkable debate. Let me tell you what the ancient Egyptians said about the Sphinx. This is a different kind of evidence from the geology and the archaeology. It is the evidence of tradition, of what the people who lived with the Sphinx, who saw it every day, who built temples in front of it and cleared sand from around it across millennia, believed about its origins and its meaning. Tradition is not proof. The stories people tell about ancient monuments are often mythologized, confused with later additions, or simply invented by priestly traditions, seeking to enhance the prestige of a sacred site. The oral and textual traditions of ancient Egypt are no more immune to these tendencies than any other tradition, but tradition can preserve real memory. The specific stories that ancient societies tell about their oldest monuments sometimes contain genuine information about those monuments. Information that was transmitted from the people who built them, modified and mythologized over time, but retaining a kernel of historical fact. Whether any given tradition falls into this category or the category of pure invention is a question that requires careful analysis. The Dream Stele is the most direct ancient Egyptian text that speaks about the Sphinx, and we have already mentioned it in the context of the conventional dating. Let me return to it here with more attention. The Dream Stele was erected between the paws of the Sphinx by Thutmose IV, who ruled Egypt from approximately 1401 to 1391 BCE. More than 1,000 years after the conventional date of the Sphinx's construction, and more than 1,500 years after Schoch's proposed date, Thutmose IV erected the stele to commemorate a dream he had while resting in the shadow of the Sphinx before he became pharaoh. According to the stele, the Sphinx appeared to Thutmose in the dream and identified itself as the sun god Ra-Horakhti, a solar deity associated with the horizon. The Sphinx told Thutmose that it was buried in sand and asked Thutmose to clear the sand away. In return, the Sphinx promised Thutmose would become king of Egypt. Thutmose became king. He cleared the sand, and he erected the stele to record the transaction. The stele is significant for several reasons beyond its narrative content. First, it establishes that by the New Kingdom period, the Sphinx was already so deeply buried in sand that a future pharaoh could rest in its shadow without seeing the full monument. The sand had accumulated to the level of the neck, burying the lion body entirely. This tells us something about the rate at which the desert encroaches on the Sphinx enclosure. A relevant piece of data for thinking about how the monument would have been maintained or neglected across the much longer timescale that Schoch proposes. Second, the stele contains the damaged passage that some Egyptologists have interpreted as a reference to Khafre. The cartouche that would, if fully legible, identify Khafre as an earlier restorer of the Sphinx. This passage is one of the primary textual supports for the Khafre dating, and its damaged condition is one of the primary weaknesses of the textual case. Third, the specific identification of the Sphinx with Ra-Horakhti, with the sun at the horizon, is relevant to the astronomical orientation of the monument. the Sphinx faces due east toward the rising sun. At the spring equinox, the sun rises at almost exactly due east, and the Sphinx faces the rising sun directly. Some researchers have proposed that this specific orientation was intentional, that the Sphinx was designed as an astronomical marker pointing to the equinox sunrise. If the Sphinx was built as an astronomical marker, the question of when it was built might be connected to the question of what astronomical event it was marking. Researchers including Robert Schoch have proposed that the orientation of the Sphinx and the pyramids encodes astronomical alignments that date the complex to specific periods. Proposals that have attracted both interest and controversy, and that we will not explore in full tonight. Now let me turn to the Hall of Records hypothesis, because it is one of the most persistent and most discussed claims about the Sphinx, and it deserves honest engagement. The Hall of Records is a hypothetical hidden chamber or archive beneath or near the Sphinx that is supposed to contain the records of a lost civilization. The documents, artifacts, or other materials that would prove the existence of an advanced pre-dynastic society and reveal its knowledge and history. The idea of a Hall of Records beneath the Sphinx is not ancient. It derives primarily from the readings of the American psychic Edgar Cayce, who in the early 20th century produced a series of trance readings in which he described Atlantis, the lost civilization he believed had existed before the flood. Cayce's readings described a Hall of Records beneath the right paw of the Sphinx, placed there by survivors of Atlantis around 10,500 BCE. Cayce's readings are not evidence for anything. They are the products of a trance state and carry no scientific weight. But the idea they generated has become culturally persistent. The Hall of Records has appeared in countless popular books and documentaries about the Sphinx and Giza, and the belief that something is hidden beneath the Sphinx has motivated multiple investigations. In the 1990s, a team from Florida State University conducted ground-penetrating radar surveys around and beneath the Sphinx enclosure. The surveys revealed a number of subsurface anomalies, cavities, voids, and areas of different density beneath the Sphinx and in the surrounding rock. These anomalies have been interpreted in various ways. Schoch and others who support the ancient Sphinx hypothesis have pointed to them as possible evidence of chambers or tunnels that could represent architectural features from an earlier period of construction or use. Mainstream Egyptologists have pointed out that voids and cavities in porous limestone are entirely normal geological features that do not require any human construction to explain. The Egyptian authorities have not facilitated excavation or direct investigation of the subsurface anomalies beneath the Sphinx. Access to the area beneath the monument for invasive investigation has been denied or not forthcoming. This denial has, predictably, fueled the belief in some quarters that the Egyptian authorities are concealing something significant. The most charitable interpretation of the access denial is that the Egyptian authorities are appropriately cautious about invasive investigation of a World Heritage Site. The most cynical interpretation is that they are protecting a politically inconvenient secret. The most likely interpretation is somewhere in between, a mixture of bureaucratic caution, national pride, and the genuine concern that poorly conducted investigations could damage the monument. There is no compelling evidence that there is a Hall of Records beneath the Sphinx. The subsurface anomalies detected by ground-penetrating radar are consistent with natural geological features and do not require a human-constructed archive to explain. The specific claim that a cache of Atlantean records is hidden beneath the right paw is not supported by any evidence beyond the trance readings of Edgar Cayce. What there may be beneath the Sphinx is evidence relevant to the water erosion debate. Evidence of the subsurface weathering depth and pattern that would help characterize the age and the mechanism of the erosion. ground-penetrating radar and seismic surveys can provide some information about this, but the most direct evidence would come from boring or coring into the bedrock beneath the enclosure floor, an invasive procedure that has not been permitted. The genuine scientific questions about what lies beneath the Sphinx are therefore distinct from the Hall of Records mythology that has surrounded them. The mythology is not credible. The scientific questions are real. And the ancient Egyptian texts, for their part, say nothing about a Hall of Records. They say something much more interesting. They say that the Sphinx is old, older than they fully understood. The dream Stele speaks of the Sphinx as if it were an ancient god, as if it had existed long before the pharaoh who dreamed beside it, long before the new kingdom, perhaps long before memory could reach. The ancient Egyptians were not naive about the age of their monuments. They had a long tradition of historical consciousness, of recording the deeds of past kings and the histories of temples and cities. They knew what was old and what was new. And what they said about the Sphinx was that it was very, very old. That tradition may be nothing more than the accumulation of mythological inflation over centuries. Monuments becoming more ancient in story than they are in stone. Or it may preserve something real, a memory of a time before the dynasties, before the writing, before the flood of history covered everything. Let me spend more time with the specific evidence from the Egyptian textual tradition about the Sphinx's age, because there is more here than the dream Stele alone. The inventory. Stele, which I mentioned in the second part of tonight's journey, is one of the most contested documents in the argument about the Sphinx's age. It was found at Giza in the 19th century and is dated by most Egyptologists to the late period of Egyptian history, approximately 600 to 300 BCE, roughly 1500 years after the Old Kingdom and roughly 2000 years after the period when Khafre supposedly built the Sphinx. The stele was erected by Khufu, or purports to have been erected by Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid, Khafre's predecessor. It records a series of events and constructions that Khufu is credited with undertaking at Giza, including the restoration of a number of monuments that were already ancient in his time. Among these is a specific reference to the Sphinx, described as having been damaged by lightning, as an already existing monument that Khufu was restoring rather than building. If the inventory stele were genuine, if it were a contemporaneous record from Khufu's reign, rather than a document written 1,000 years later, it would constitute direct evidence that the Sphinx predates Khufu and therefore predates Khafre. It would place the construction of the Sphinx before approximately 2550 BCE. The mainstream Egyptological position is that the stele is not genuine in the sense of being contemporaneous with Khufu. It is a late period document written in an archaic style to make it look older than it is, a kind of pious forgery in which later priests attributed ancient deeds to Khufu in order to enhance the prestige of their cult and their site. The specific linguistic and stylistic features of the stele are, according to Egyptologists who have analysed it in detail, consistent with a late period date rather than an Old Kingdom date. The inventory. Stele is therefore dismissed as evidence for the Sphinx's age on the grounds that it is a late forgery. But there is a specific problem with this dismissal that defenders of an older Sphinx have pointed out. The late period priests who wrote the inventory stele were drawing on something, some tradition, some earlier record, some oral or textual source that they were translating into their document. They may have been forging the date and the attribution, but the specific content, the description of the Sphinx as an existing monument that Khufu restored, may reflect a genuine tradition about the Sphinx's history. If there was a tradition in late period Egypt that the Sphinx was older than Khafre, old enough that Khufu, who preceded Khafre, found it already standing and in need of restoration, that tradition itself is a piece of evidence. Not conclusive evidence. Tradition can be invented as easily as it can be transmitted, but a tradition that runs counter to the conventional dating of the Sphinx, surviving in a document that was itself designed to look ancient, is at least worth noting. There is also the broader tradition within Egyptian culture of the Tepi, the first time. This is one of the most important concepts in Egyptian cosmology, and it refers to the primordial period at the beginning of creation, when the gods walked the earth and established the order that Egyptian civilization was designed to maintain. The Tepi was not understood by the ancient Egyptians as a mythological period in the ordinary sense. It was not simply a story about how the world came to be. It was a real period of history, now inaccessible to ordinary human memory, in which the foundations of Egyptian civilization were established. The temples, the monuments, the sacred sites of Egypt were all, in the Egyptian understanding, established in the Tepi, or according to patterns that originated in the Tepi. The specific claim of Egyptian temples to authority and sanctity derived in large part from their connection to this primordial founding period, from the assertion that the temple had been built on the site where a specific event of the Tepi occurred, or that its plan was based on a plan laid down in the Tepi. The Sphinx in this framework is not just a very old monument. It is a monument that belongs to the Tepi, to the period of origins before human history. Whether this is a genuine memory of a prehistoric monument or a mythological framing applied to a monument that was old but not quite, that old is not determinable from the textual evidence alone. But the Egyptian tradition consistently treats the Sphinx as more ancient than the dynasties. That consistency, maintained across thousands of years of Egyptian history, is itself a form of evidence. Not geological evidence, not archaeological evidence, but traditional evidence of the kind that sometimes preserves genuine historical memory. The Sphinx is old. The ancient Egyptians knew it was old. How old is the question? And the question is still open. Let me think about what it would mean, not in the popular sense of what it would mean for the lost civilization narratives, the Atlantis stories, the theories about advanced prehistoric technology. I want to think about it in a more fundamental sense. What would it actually mean for how we understand ourselves, our history, and our relationship to the past if the conventional timeline of human civilization needed significant revision? The conventional timeline tells a specific story. It is the story of a species that spent most of its existence in simple, dispersed, technologically limited societies. Hunter-gatherers whose lives were shaped entirely by the natural world around them, and that then, approximately 10,000 years ago, began the transition to agriculture that eventually produced cities, writing, states, and everything we call civilization. In this story, the last 10,000 years are the whole of the meaningful human story. Everything that came before, the hundreds of thousands of years of human existence before agriculture, is a prologue of limited relevance. We are the descendants of the agricultural revolution, not of the hunter-gatherers who preceded it. The civilization we live in is the continuation and the development of the revolution that began at the end of the last ice age. This story is not wrong. Agriculture did transform human society in the ways the conventional account describes. Cities, writing, and states did emerge from the agricultural revolution. The specific capabilities of modern civilization, its science, its technology, its organizational complexity, are products of the long developmental process that began with the domestication of plants and animals. But the story may be incomplete. The evidence from Göbekli Tepe and Nabta Playa and the African Humid Period suggests that the period before agriculture was not simply a prologue of limited relevance, that the hunter-gatherer and early pastoralist societies of the late Pleistocene and early Holocene were more complex, more capable and more culturally rich than the conventional account credited. If the Sphinx is ancient, if it was built during or before the African Humid Period by a society that preceded the dynastic Egyptians, it is a monument to this more complex prehistory. It is physical evidence that the story we have been telling is incomplete. Not wrong in its outlines, but incomplete in a specific and important way. It has drawn the line between the meaningful human past and the irrelevant human past in the wrong place. The meaningful human past may extend further back than we thought. The specific people who carved the Sphinx, if Schoch is right, were not simple, opportunistic foragers. They had enough organizational capacity, enough technical knowledge, and enough cultural motivation to plan and execute a major quarrying project. They had a relationship to place and to meaning that led them to invest that capacity in a specific form, at a specific location. They were, in short, people with histories and intentions and beliefs, and the specific human qualities that we associate with meaningful civilization. What this requires of us, if it is true, is a revision of the story we tell about our past. Not a dramatic revision, not the abandonment of the conventional account in favor of the lost civilization narratives, but a quiet, careful, honest revision that pushes the frontier of the meaningful human past a few thousand years further back, and acknowledges that the world before agriculture was not simply waiting for agriculture to make it interesting. This kind of revision happens in science. It has happened repeatedly in the history of our understanding of deep time. The history of the Earth and the history of life and the history of our own species. Each major revision has extended the meaningful past further back, has found complexity and significance in periods that previously appeared featureless. The discovery of plate tectonics revealed that the apparently static surface of the Earth has been in constant dynamic motion for billions of years. The discovery of the Cambrian explosion revealed that the rapid diversification of animal life happened far earlier than anyone had imagined. These revisions did not invalidate what was known before. They contextualized it differently. They showed that the story was more complex and more interesting than it had appeared. A revision of the human past along the lines that Schoch's hypothesis requires would be the same kind of thing. It would not invalidate what we know about pharaonic Egypt or Mesopotamia or the ancient world. It would contextualize those civilizations differently. As the most recent and most visible part of a human story that has been going on for longer and in more complex ways than we previously understood. Now let me think about the specific way that history is made. How we come to know what we know about the ancient past, and how that process shapes what we believe. History is not simply the accumulation of facts about the past. It is the construction of narratives from incomplete evidence. Narratives that explain the evidence we have, that are consistent with the facts we know, and that make sense as stories. The facts constrain the narratives, but they do not determine them uniquely. Different narratives can be consistent with the same facts, and the choice between them involves judgments about plausibility, parsimony, and coherence that are not simply matters of evidence. The conventional dating of the Sphinx is a historical narrative, a story about when and how the Sphinx was built that is consistent with the available evidence and that fits into the broader narrative of Egyptian civilization. The water erosion hypothesis is an alternative narrative, a different story about when and how the Sphinx was built that is also consistent with some of the available evidence, though inconsistent with other aspects of it. Neither narrative is simply the truth. Both are attempts to make sense of incomplete evidence. The conventional narrative has the advantage of greater consistency with the broad archaeological record. The water erosion narrative has the advantage of fitting the specific geological evidence of the enclosure walls. Choosing between them is not a simple matter of following the facts. It is a matter of judging which of two imperfect narratives is better supported by the totality of the evidence. This is how history works, and it is worth remembering when we feel the pull of certainty about the ancient past, that the certainty is always provisional, always contingent on the evidence we have found so far, always subject to revision when new evidence emerges. The Sphinx has been standing for at least 4,000 years. For most of that time, humans who encountered it brought their own stories to it, their own explanations of its age and meaning and purpose. Each generation, in some sense, constructed its own Sphinx from the evidence available to it. We are doing the same thing. The geological evidence is new. The paleoclimatological data is new. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe is new. Each of these has shifted the story slightly, has made one possible narrative a little more plausible, another a little less. But the Sphinx itself is unchanged. It is the same stone it was when the first human eyes looked at it. It is the same orientation toward the rising sun, the same weathered limestone, the same question written in the erosion on its walls. We are still, after all these centuries, trying to read that question, and we are not sure we have it right yet. Let me dwell a little longer with the specific quality of historical uncertainty that the Sphinx embodies, because it is a particularly interesting kind of uncertainty, different in character from the uncertainties of natural science. When a physicist is uncertain about the mass of the Higgs boson or the rate of the universe's expansion, the uncertainty is in principle resolvable by better measurements. The physical quantity exists and has a definite value. The uncertainty is about our knowledge of that value, not about the value itself. Better instruments, more measurements, and more careful analysis will eventually narrow the uncertainty. The historical uncertainty about the Sphinx is different. The Sphinx was built at a specific time, by specific people, for specific reasons. These are facts with definite values. There is a true answer to the question of when the Sphinx was built, even if we do not know what it is. But the evidence that would allow us to determine that answer with certainty may no longer exist. It may have been destroyed by the passage of time, by the accumulated occupation of the site, by the very weathering processes we have been discussing. The uncertainty about the Sphinx is not just epistemic, not just a gap in our knowledge that more careful analysis can fill. It may be ontological, a situation in which the evidence needed to resolve the question has been permanently lost, and in which the question may therefore never be answered with the confidence that the physicist can aspire to. This is one of the ways in which the ancient past is genuinely different from the natural world. The natural world is present. It can be measured and remeasured, and uncertainties can be reduced over time. The ancient past is absent. It left traces, but the traces are incomplete, and some of them are gone beyond recovery. The Sphinx water erosion debate sits at the boundary between what the surviving traces can tell us and what they cannot. Schoch's geological argument extracts meaningful information from one kind of trace, the weathering of the limestone. The archaeological argument extracts meaningful information from another kind of trace, the material culture of the sites surrounding the Sphinx. Both kinds of trace are real. Both carry information, but they carry different information, and the information they carry is not fully consistent. In this situation, where different traces tell different stories, the honest response is not to choose one story and ignore the other, but to hold both simultaneously. To say, the geological evidence points toward an older sphinx, the archaeological evidence points toward a younger one. The specific question of which interpretation is correct cannot be determined with certainty from the evidence we currently have. This is intellectually uncomfortable. We want to know. We want the story to resolve. We want the Sphinx to give up its secret. But the Sphinx is under no obligation to do so. It has been here longer than any human institution. It has watched civilizations rise and fall and be forgotten. It has been buried in sand and cleared and buried again. It has been interpreted as a god, as a pharaoh, as an astronomical marker, as the guardian of hidden knowledge, as the product of a lost civilization, as a standard piece of old kingdom statuary. Every interpretation reflects the interpreters as much as the monument. Every generation brings its questions to the Sphinx, and the Sphinx returns the questions unchanged. What the Sphinx is, finally, is a question mark carved in stone. The world's largest, oldest, most durable question mark. And the question it asks, who made this, and when, and why, is the question that humanity has been asking about its own origins for as long as we have been capable of asking questions at all. Let me close part 11 with a thought about what it means to ask that question in the 21st century. After all the archaeology and the geology and the paleoclimatology and the dating techniques and the seismic surveys, we know more about the Sphinx today than at any point in human history since it was made. We have tools and methods that would have been incomprehensible to every previous generation of people who stood in its shadow and wondered. We can measure the carbon in its material, analyze the chemistry of its weathering, probe its subsurface geology with sound waves, compare it with satellite imagery of the surrounding landscape. And we still do not know how old it is. This specific persistence of uncertainty in the face of increasing capability is itself one of the most interesting features of the debate. In many areas of ancient history, the advance of science has resolved questions that seemed permanently mysterious. The decipherment of Linear B, the dating of human migration out of Africa, the genetic analysis of ancient population movements. Questions that seemed permanently obscure have been answered definitively by the application of new techniques to old problems. The Sphinx question has been resistant to this pattern. Each advance in technique has produced new information without resolving the core uncertainty. The seismic surveys produced the asymmetry data. The ground-penetrating radar found the subsurface anomalies. The paleoclimatology refined the picture of the African Humid Period. But none of it has produced the specific, decisive evidence that would settle the age question once and for all. Perhaps the decisive evidence does not exist. Perhaps the processes that would have preserved it, or the contexts in which it would have been created, simply did not produce the kind of record that survives for 10,000 years. Perhaps it exists but has not yet been found, in an archive not yet fully searched, in a layer of soil not yet excavated, in a subsurface void not yet investigated. Or perhaps the Sphinx will keep its secret indefinitely. Ancient things are not obligated to yield to our curiosity. They were here before the curiosity existed. They will remain when the curiosity has passed. Let the night settle around the Sphinx. It is late, the same hour we imagined at the beginning of tonight's journey, 3 in the morning on the Giza Plateau, when the tourist coaches are gone and the vendors are gone and the camel handlers are gone, and the site is returned to its own quiet. The stars are out over the western desert. The pyramids are dark masses against the darker sky to the southwest. The cool air of the desert night, which drops surprisingly fast from the heat of the day, moves gently across the plateau. And in the hollow of the enclosure facing east toward the place where the sun will rise in a few hours, the Sphinx rests. It has been resting here through the days and the nights for at least 4,000 years, possibly much longer. The specific number is what we have been debating all night, but the fact of its presence, the specific weight and solidity and antiquity of the thing, is not in dispute. Whatever its age, the Sphinx has been here through the Pharaonic dynasties and the Greek conquest and the Roman occupation and the Arab conquest and the Mamluk sultans and Napoleon's army and the British protectorate and the modern Egyptian republic. Every political form that has claimed authority over this part of the world has stood in the shadow of the Sphinx. None of them made it. None of them will outlast it. The limestone of the Sphinx is the same limestone as the Plateau, the same rock that was here before any human being looked at it, the same rock that formed at the bottom of a shallow sea approximately 50 million years ago, when the Eocene ocean covered what is now the Sahara. The Sphinx is carved from the floor of an Eocene sea. The nummulitic limestone, full of the tiny disc-shaped shells of the foraminifera that lived in that ancient ocean, was laid down over millions of years, and then uplifted by the tectonic movements that raised the North African plateau. A human being carved it into the shape of a lion, or a god, or a pharaoh, or a symbol of the equinox sun. We do not know with certainty which, or when, or entirely why. Let that not knowing rest here in the dark, without urgency. The not knowing is not a failure. It is the honest condition of a person confronting a thing that is older than memory, older than the tradition that might have explained it, older than the writing that might have recorded it. The Sphinx has outlasted the explanation of itself. Whatever story the people who made it told about their creation, that story is gone. What remains is the object and the question, the object and the question. Let me try to find the words for what the Sphinx means, standing here in the dark at Giza. It means that human beings have been shaping stone into meaning for a very long time. For at least 4,000 years, probably longer, specific human beings looked at a specific rock outcrop on a specific plateau above the Nile Valley and decided to make it into something. To take the raw material of the world and impose on it a form that corresponded to something in their minds, their cosmology, their understanding of what was significant. This is not a small thing. It is one of the defining human activities. The imposition of form on matter in response to meaning. We do it when we build houses and make tools and write books and paint pictures. We have been doing it for as long as we have been recognizably human. The Sphinx is one of the most durable products of this activity, one of the objects in which the imposition of human form on raw matter has been most thoroughly preserved against the erosion of time. The stone kept the form kept the question, and the question has been traveling toward us across the desert of the years. Now let me think about what it means to have spent this night with the Sphinx, to have traced the geology of its weathering, the climate history of the African Humid Period, the archaeological silence about its origins, the ancient Egyptian tradition of its age, the philosophical question of what it would mean for our understanding of ourselves if the conventional timeline needed revision. This kind of sustained attention to an ancient thing is not merely academic. It is a way of extending the range of the present, of including in the space of what is currently alive and relevant not just the last few decades or centuries, but the full depth of the human past. The Sphinx connects tonight to 10,000 years ago, or 7,000 years ago, or 4,500 years ago, depending on which interpretation you find most credible. Either way, the connection is enormous. We are not usually good at feeling the full depth of that connection. The daily world presses in. The immediate, the urgent, the specific demands of the present moment crowd out the sense of how far back the story goes and how much has happened before we arrived. The particular gift of the small hours of the night, the gift of the sleep hour, is that the daily world recedes a little. The urgency diminishes. The range of attention can extend. In the extended range of the night, the Sphinx is not a distant abstraction. It is present. It is on the Giza Plateau right now, in this same night, facing east as it has faced east for thousands of years. The desert air is moving around it. The stars that the ancient Egyptians named and mapped are above it. The Nile is flowing in its valley to the east, as it has flowed since before there were people to watch it. The world that made the Sphinx is continuous with the world you are in right now. The stone connects the present to the past in a way that no text can quite match, because the stone is the same stone, the same physical matter, the same specific atoms of calcium carbonate that were laid down in the Eocene Sea and carved into a lion by human hands at some point in the deep past. The text changes in copying. The stone does not change. The Sphinx is the same object it was when it was made. That continuity of matter is one of the most extraordinary facts about ancient monuments. It is why they move us in a way that reproductions do not. The original Sphinx is the thing itself, not a representation of a thing that existed once, not a copy, not an image, the thing. The specific object that specific hands shaped and that has been here, in this specific place, through everything that has happened since. Let that rest in the mind now. The specific physicality of it, the weight of the limestone, the specific grain of the nummulitic rock, the specific quality of the weathering on the enclosure walls, whatever produced it, rainfall or salt or the slow chemistry of time, running in its ancient vertical channels down the face of the stone. The face of the Sphinx turned east, the same sun coming. As it has come every morning since there was a sun to rise, let the geology rest now. Let the debate rest. Let Schoch and Hawass both rest, on opposite sides of their disagreement, each having made their best case, neither having prevailed. Let the African Humid Period rest, the memory of grass on the Sahara, the memory of cattle and rivers and rock painters who made their art in a world that is now buried under sand. Let the enclosure walls hold their question quietly. Let the limestone say what it says without insisting on being heard. You have heard it tonight. The question about when and who and why. You have held it carefully, turning it over, looking at it from the geological side and the archaeological side and the philosophical side, not forcing it to resolve, letting it rest in its honest condition of uncertainty. That is enough. That is, in fact, more than most questions get. Let yourself settle now into the specific peace of having paid attention to something ancient and large, and genuinely uncertain. The peace that comes not from having found an answer, but from having fully inhabited a question. From having been present with the not knowing in a way that is itself a form of understanding. The Sphinx is still there, still facing east, still weathered, still ancient, still asking. Sleep well, but stay with it a moment longer if you will. There is something specific about the Sphinx that I have not yet said. Something about its relationship to time that is worth sitting with before the night ends. The Sphinx faces east because the sun rises in the east. It was designed, whoever designed it and whenever they did it, to be in a specific relationship to the movement of the heavens, to mark or acknowledge or embody something about the relationship between the stone earth and the moving sky. The sun it faces has risen every day since the monument was made. If the conventional date is right, if the Sphinx was built around 2500 BCE, the sun has risen approximately 1.5 million times since those first workers began quarrying the enclosure. If Schoch's earlier estimate is right, if the original carving dates to 7000 BCE, the sun has risen approximately 3.5 million times since the work began. 3.5 million sunrises, each one falling on the same eastward-facing stone. The scale of that number is difficult to feel. Human experience is calibrated to the human lifespan, to decades and centuries, not to millions of days. The specific experience of 3.5 million sunrises is beyond imagination in any direct sense. And yet the stone is here. The stone absorbed each of those sunrises and is still here, still facing east, still waiting for the next one. The stone makes the number real in a way that mathematics alone cannot. The weathering on the enclosure walls is the physical record of all those days. The accumulated effect of millions of mornings and noons and evenings and nights on a specific piece of limestone. The debate about the Sphinx is, in its deepest sense, a debate about how to read that physical record, about what the stone is trying to tell us, if we can find the language to hear it. We have been trying to find that language for 30 years. We have not fully succeeded yet, but the effort itself has been worthwhile. The effort has produced new knowledge about the weathering of limestone, about the climate history of the Sahara, about the capabilities of prehistoric human societies, about the specific evidentiary challenges of studying the deep past. The Sphinx has made us smarter by resisting us. And now, the night is long enough that you can rest. The sun will rise again in a few hours over the Giza Plateau. The Sphinx will still be there to receive it. The question will still be written in the limestone. But right now, it is dark. The desert is quiet. The stars are out. And the ancient stone is waiting, as it always waits, for the light to come back. Sleep well.